Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the 6th episode of the story that tells of what if the second Shinobi World War left Yuzu destroyed out of fear. Its inhabitants were left slaughtered or scattered. However, what if the members of Uzushio's famed Uzumaki weren't as scattered as people thought? What would it mean for one Uzumaki Naruto? After watching, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. Gato may have had the advantage of numbers, but the wave magnate had forgotten one crucial thing: his opponents were shinobi. In a fair fight, the overwhelming numbers of Gato's mercenary army may have indeed tipped the scales irreparably, but as none of his opponents intended to fight fairly, that calculation was somewhat flawed. This was best demonstrated when Kimiko blew up. Well, blew up was perhaps a bit misleading. Rather, the red-headed enforcer of the Uzumaki clan bit her non-bleeding thumb and, together with her already bleeding thumb, ran both digits down her clavicle, causing her entire being to shine as Fuin characters glowed bright green. What the foo? Zabuza could be heard yelling, just before Kimiko cried out. Kochios. Kakashi winced as the glow became unbearable, and looked away. All around him, he heard hundreds of mercenaries similarly yell out in pain as their eyes were beset by the powerful shine of Kimiko's body. Honestly, Kakashi had some money down in his head that she was about to self-destruct. Nothing of the sort happened, of course. Rather, when the glow died down just as suddenly as it had appeared, Kimiko was no longer in her prior attire. Gone was the ceremonial-looking armor, replaced now by a much more reinforced suit of armor. Her traditional do, a collection of steel plates, was now gone, replaced by a single steel cuirass. Her helmet, too, became more rounded, with a slit of steel protecting her nose. Her sodi were also forged in the same vein as her new cuirass, and her leg plate seemed ready to withstand a lot of punishment. In short, she had transformed into a walking fortress. Minamike's no Yoroi, she declared firmly, crossing two Yari spears in front of her before sliding into a ready stance. Kakashi chuckled. Nice trick, he observed, unsheathing a kunai and smiling under his mask as he observed the mercenaries actually hesitate for a moment at the sight of Kimiko's new armor. Humph, Zabuza grunted. Flash isn't everything to a shinobi, Red, he remarked disapprovingly, burying his sword's blade into the ground in front of him while he raised his hands into a familiar seal. First rule of stealth kills if they can't see you. All around the foursome, thick mist rapidly morphed into being, quickly hiding them from Gato and his mercenaries' view. As the mob of mercenaries began to get swallowed up by the mist, the first cries of panic and surprise began to emerge. They can't stop you, Zabuza's ghostly voice finished, just before someone screamed in the mist. Kakashi smiled grimly under his mask as he privately agreed with the missing Nin's assessment and tore through a lone mercenary's jugular with his kunai. Despite Zabuza's skills having noticeably dropped during his stint as a missing Nin, he couldn't help but appreciate the man's extensive stealth abilities. He imagined that if Zabuza had consistently been in top form, he might have even had a bit of trouble dealing with the former Kiri Nin. But right now, they were on the same side, and that was a small measure of comfort, he supposed. To his left, he heard more screaming, followed by a dark chuckle. It prompted a raised eyebrow, as he reflected that perhaps Zabuza was enjoying himself a bit too much. To his right, however, he heard a woman give out a battle cry, just before the sound of tearing flesh hit his ears. Kimiko, too, was adapting well to her current circumstances, despite her admitted hatred for Kiri and all persons affiliated, however loosely, to it. Then, to his front, he felt a stiff, cold breeze, and took note of the strange silence coming from that direction. Unlike Zabuza or Kimiko, Haku seemed content to just carry out his kills without the added psychological shock value. He could respect that. As a former ANBU operative, Kakashi hadn't much liked the idea of making statements with his kills. All that really mattered was that it was carried out as per the Hokage's orders. Therefore, quick and efficient was the best way to go. Besides, his renowned kill count served as sufficient deterrence for most run-of-the-mill shinobi. Kakashi eyed his student's still body behind him. While Kimiko, Zabuza, and the one called Haku seemed at ease with going on the offensive, Kakashi hadn't forgotten that his primary duty was to safeguard his students. He knew that there were many in Konoha who wouldn't have minded something untoward happening to Naruto, but he'd be damned if it happened on his watch. He snapped his gaze to the right, just as a mercenary blindly stumbled towards him, and quickly dispatched the man by snapping his neck. Silence was his greatest weapon, after all. Two more mercenaries managed to find him, and both met with equally final fates. As he stood over their bodies, however, he couldn't help but notice that the screams were becoming less and less common, which made little sense, given the sheer amount of mercenaries Gato had brought with him. In fact, by his estimation, their human wave tactics ought to have caused the amount of deaths to increase consistently over time, yet the opposite was now taking place. He knew Zabuza, Kimiko, and Haku couldn't have finished off the mob by themselves already, not with the way they were fighting, so the lack of activity within the fog made no sense unless the mercenaries were retreating and no longer advancing into the fog. Kakashi froze in place, quickly running that line of thought down. Why would the mercenaries stop their advance? As far as they knew, they had advantage in numbers, and he and his companions were tired from subduing Naruto. That was the logical conclusion to this situation. Furthermore, given Gato's character, the idea of the businessman abandoning his attack over something as commonplace as mist seemed odd. Everything about the man screamed overconfidence and bluster. Unless they had misjudged him. Kakashi eyed the place on his arm where the Uzumaki tattoo had been temporarily placed. Quickly, he sent a chakra message over the link, hoping he was wrong. Unfortunately, he wasn't. Kimiko quickly confirmed his auditory observation that the mercenaries were charging less and less. Many of her most recent victims, the screams he could still hear on occasion, happened to be lost mercenaries, not members of a vanguard. He had little doubt this also applied to Zabuza, whose dark chuckles had also lost their gleeful edge. Which meant Gato wasn't as much of a stubborn idiot as they'd first thought. The wily businessman had clearly some brain cells left in that insidious pit of filth he called a mind. But if that was the case, then it was Kakashi's job to counter the countermove. Sending another message through the tattoo, he hoped his strategy had gotten through effectively enough, because otherwise this one-sided battle could turn ugly very fast. It was laughable, really being gifted with the ability to use chakra. Modern shinobi should have had no problem with mercenaries, especially A and S rank shinobis like his current makeshift team. However, all it really took to kill a shinobi was a solid plan and a lucky shot. Both of which became considerably easier to achieve if you had the numbers to carry out the sort of plans this would require, and had the pick of the battlefield. Both advantages which Gato held. Zabuza's mist had managed to rebalance the scales for a bit, but Kakashi personally doubted that Gato's numbers had been significantly affected by the mist slaughter. Maybe 24 jutsus flew through his mind that he knew would put an end to this situation, with Gato's forces wholly routed and his team out in one piece. Unfortunately, most of them would also cause substantial collateral damage, and he couldn't confirm whether or not there were still civilians in the area who hadn't been able to get out since Naruto began his rampage. Akiri or Iwa Nin might not have cared and gone through with the devastation, but Konoha had a public image to protect, handicap or not. That meant he would have to keep things localized, and ensure that Zabuza did the same. Beads of sweat began to accumulate on his brow as his mind raced through every possibility. The mist's humidity was causing him to feel a bit hazy, which wasn't all that surprising. In fact, if the mercenaries had kept up their charge, this would have been a boon to him and his squad. Zabuza, he called out. They're not going to fall for the mist anymore. Best take it down, he observed. He heard a soft, disgruntled grunt, before his eyesight began improving, until he could see the bodies of his victims on the ground once again, followed by hazy figures nearby, and finally the buildings and mob of mercenaries waiting about 12 meters from the edge of the mist. Within moments, Kimiko, Haku, and Zabuza rejoined him, all of them distinctly bearing spatters of blood on their clothing. None of it seemed theirs, either. Only 3, Kakashi. Zabuza growled in what seemed like a mix of irritation and amusement. You're getting soft. Someone had to keep an eye on Naruto-sama, you thick-headed brute, Kimiko sneered. The glare Zabuza shot her could have melted ice. You want to go, bitch? He snarled. Knock it off, you too, Kakashi stepped in then. They couldn't afford arguments right now, not with Gato still looking so confident. Anyone else, and Kakashi would have called it hubris, but the man gave off a vibe that said he wasn't as stupid as he looked. Focus that anger on the one who really matters. Both Kimiko and Zabuza exchanged a hateful glance before turning their attention forward, weapons ready. Gato, they agreed, almost in unison. Thank you for that, Hataki-san, Kakashi heard Zabuza's assistant say softly. This is hardly an opportune moment to settle any grudges. Kakashi nodded in acknowledgement before eyeing the rest of their surroundings. The mob at their back seemed to have thinned the most, while the one in front seemed grimly determined. In both cases, it seemed as though their center had become remarkably more sparse, but he had no doubts this was just bait. They're baiting us to move, to charge head-on, he observed. I'll bet you anything they've taken over those buildings on the flanks and are lying in ambush. Zabuza growled. You know, these infantile tactics are starting to piss me off, the missing Nin said, glaring at his foes. Treating us like common grunts. I've got half a mind to lay waste to the town. Judging from Kimiko's expression, Kakashi surmised that she felt quite similar. Unfortunately, collateral damage was something Konoha tried to avoid at all costs. It came with the whole good guy image they'd been trying to sell to the general public. As such, it was absolutely necessary to exhaust all other possible options before going nuts. Fortunately, he wasn't considered one of the smartest shinobi in Konoha for nothing. We don't need to play their game, he told his comrades, rubbing his shoulder. Just keep them busy for a little while longer. Kimiko eyed him with a narrowed gaze before nodding, followed by Haku. Zabuza was far less obliging. What the hell's crawling up your sleeve, Kakashi? He asked, that feral gleam in his eyes returning. Kakashi kept his gaze fixed upon the enemies to his front. Just a little surprise. Urarurura Naruto's mindscape well, as far as Naruto could tell, his rampage was over with. That was the good news. The bad news, on the other hand, was somewhat more precarious. Even if he was done being a small force of doom and destruction, he still couldn't seem to wake up. He eyed the open pipe that had funneled the Kyuubi's chakra before, and saw it had actually disappeared, revealing only a flat surface where once there had been a ditch. Looking behind him, he saw the endless expanse of the sewer tunnel he seemed to be stuck in. He had tried to walk, then run down its length as far as he could, in the hopes of finding an exit of some kind, but nothing had worked. The moment he turned back to look at the cage, he found himself standing no more than a dozen meters from its gigantic bars, the Kyuubi looking quite bemused by his futile escape attempts. Pathetic. Naruto closed his eyes and tightened his fists as he remained hunched over, breathing deeply as he ended his latest escape attempt. The Kyuubi's snide remarks weren't helping, of course, and he was sure it knew as much. It never passed up a chance to belittle him, after all. Not appreciating the snark there, hairball, he said irritably. Another throaty chuckle from the giant fox monster thing. I know. Well, if he hadn't been sure before, he certainly was now. How about helping me out of this hole, instead of flapping your gums, he snapped, looking back at the Kyuubi, who merely shifted in an attempt to get comfortable. The giant fox monster snorted, which just seemed wrong to Naruto. Giant monsters shouldn't snort. They should destroy, ravage stuff, and eventually get taken down by the gallant hero, but they shouldn't snort. And rob myself of the first instance of amusement I have had in decades? I think not. Great, so now he was the world's largest allergy menace's personal amusement. Somehow, that actually ticked him off more than actually being stuck in this place. You think this is funny, jackass? He challenged, stepping closer to the cage. If I don't get out of here, we're both screwed. An amused growl answered him. Oh. Please, enlighten me, Jailer. How could my situation possibly get any worse? Naruto stared at the fox for a moment, actually a bit stumped. As far as he knew, there may not actually be any way for the beast's situation to get worse, save for, you could be dead, he said, managing to stay oddly calm. He didn't know where he'd got the willpower to keep his infamous temper in check, but he was glad for it. Neither of us knows what's going on anymore, right? Silence answered him. For once, the fox's expression betrayed nothing but cool contemplation. It seemed as though Naruto's words had managed to get through to him. Considering I've actually managed to shut you up, I'm going to go with a yes on that end, Naruto quipped, before pointing towards the unending tunnel behind him. So right now, how do you know no one's trying to kill us? Or capture us? He quickly added, that particular dimension not really striking him until right now. What if I wake up, and we're forced to act like someone's attacked dog? I am the Kyuubi, maggot. I am no one's dog. The monster's furious roar almost killed Naruto's hearing, until he realized that he wasn't actually a physical person right now, and was therefore immune to such wounds in here. However, he was pleased to see he'd managed to hit a sore spot. Perhaps the fox monster hated being compared to a common canine, or perhaps it was just a point of pride. Whatever the case, Naruto was happy to exploit it. Then help me get out of here, before that becomes a very probable reality, he argued. You obviously know more about this place than I do. So how about you drop the asshole routine and help me find a way out? The Kyuubi's glare, had it been a physical force, would have likely vaporized him. However, behind that rage, he saw its monstrous intelligence hard at work, until finally its lips curled into a feral smile. Manipulating me to your own gains? There might be hope for you, yet the beast chuckled as it curled up again on the floor, apparently once again ready to nap. Hey! Didn't we just agree to helping me get out of here? Naruto demanded. Quiet, jailer. Naruto froze, seeing the Kyuubi's golden eyes trained on him. I made no such promise. The fox then chuckled. However, I have never been so amused by a measly little human maggot. So consider this a one-time boon. The fox brought out a limb and pointed a claw at him. This place is not some random location, jailer. It is an alternate reality formed of your chakra and mine, linking our minds together. What you see is but a meager reflection of our relationship. The more hatred we feel towards one another, the worse the surroundings. Naruto looked around him and, given that the place looked like a sewer, had a fair guess about how badly the mutual hate was. He hadn't even been aware of it right until the fox threw it in his face. So how do I get out? He asked impatiently. Patience. The Kyuubi seemed to be enjoying drawing this out. As this place is a link of our minds, then our minds control our ability to leave this reality. At least, that would be the case for myself, were it not for this damnable seal. The increase in hostility was swiftly accompanied by a swipe of its tails against the bars, which reverberated, but otherwise stood firm. Huh, sucks to be you, Naruto mocked childishly. The glare was back, but the Kyuubi managed to keep it in check this time, as it merely stared at him hatefully. In your case, however, your ability to leave is directly related to your state of mind. The more you give in to anguish, to hatred, to vengeance, to bloodlust, the easier you will slip into this place, and the more willing you will become in freeing me. Naruto was about to protest, until he remembered what had happened when he'd released his senses, so to speak. He had almost released the Kyuubi then. So either I become a monk, or I risk losing control. Gotcha, Naruto summed up skeptically. Silence, before I change my mind. The beast snapped, before lowering its head onto its paws again. As I was saying, if negative emotions anchor you here, then the opposite must be true. You are still here simply because, whatever little speech you gave yourself, there is a part of you holding you back. Naruto cocked his head to the side, completely baffled by this concept. Another side to him? That's crazy. He was fully in control of his feelings now, and he was all about kicking Gado's ass as payback, and then getting himself some ramen. Why? Because ramen was the food for champions. I don't get it, he said bluntly. The QB rolled its eyes, clearly unimpressed by the statement. It was oddly unsettling to see the gigantic force of nature act in such a human fashion. I am unsurprised. Your intelligence leaves a lot to be desired. Oi. However, as you've managed to convince me, a small miracle by itself, we both benefit if you survive this ordeal and remain with the maggots from your village. Therefore, I will try to lower my vocabulary to your standards. The giant fox shifted again and brought out a claw to point at him. You think you have accepted yourself, your flaws, your responsibilities, but you are kidding yourself. There is a part of you that remains terrified of all of it, and that is why you remain here, with me, rather than out there, with the other maggots. Naruto stared at the QB silently for a while, unwilling to betray the internal debate raging within. Was the fox right? Was he keeping himself in here, just to avoid dealing with all the crap waiting for him out there? His knee-jerk reaction was to tell off the QB and go on about how he was unstoppable, but this recent experience had tamed his wild spirit just a bit. Enough to reflect on another's words, even if they weren't what he wanted to hear. If he was completely honest with himself, then, he had to concede that perhaps the giant furball had a point. As determined as he'd been to get out there and kick ass and eat ramen, he still felt something holding him back. Something intangible. I'm afraid to fail, he said softly, clutching at his black shirt. The QB let out a soft, throaty growl. You begin to understand, but you are not yet there, it conceded, before turning its attention to the tunnel behind Naruto. Yet it seems even this small measure of self-reflection has been enough. Your way is open, jailer. Naruto turned to look at whatever had caught the QB's attention, and a small smile grew on his face as he observed a door materialize not too far. A door, huh? He mused. How cheesy. Simple things from a simple mind, the QB snorted. Leave now, jailer, and thank your gods that this meeting ended as it did. Next time, I will escape this hell. Naruto turned to smirk at the QB, raising a fist in challenge. Dream on, fuzzbutt, he declared. The only way out of Naruto-sama is over his dead body. With that, the blonde would-be hero ran for the door, leaving behind a bemused QB. If it comes to that. You're wave, really hoping that plan of yours starts soon, Kakashi, Zabuza growled as he pulled another arrow from his shoulder. It wasn't too deep, so he wasn't that worried about being significantly hindered. Even so, Gado had proven to be one wily asshat. The midget businessman had pulled all his mercenaries back from a shinobi group and lined them up near civilian households, in so doing preventing Kakashi, and by extension the rest of the group, from using the most dangerous of their abilities. A handicap they did not share. Firing from all sides, the shinobi group was saved from a rather unpleasant time by Haku's incredible ice abilities, which once again drew a raised eyebrow from Kimiko and Kakashi. However, short of creating a solid dome which would kill their visibility, there was no way to shut out every arrow, and sometimes these got lucky. That explained the small cuts and gashes each shinobi wore. It also explained why Zabuza's mood and compassion was rapidly dwindling. Soon, Zabuza, Kakashi assured him, while mentally wondering what the hell was taking so long. He'd really hoped his plan would have kicked in by now, as he was having just as hard a time trying to keep the arrows from gutting either himself or his comatose student. I really wish they hadn't brought shields, though, Haku's feminine voice spoke up then, the masked shinobi heaving a little in exertion as he kept up the ice walls. As Haku had stated, the mercenaries, apparently having known of Haku's abilities, had brought out large, metal shields that were protecting the front line from Haku's icicles. The move had been a remarkable stroke of cunning from Gado, especially given that Kakashi had expected him to hire run-of-the-mill mercenaries. Yet, from the looks of his foes, these seemed to be former soldiers and samurai. Meaning they knew how to deal with shinobi, to some extent. On any barren battlefield, that wouldn't have meant squat. But in the middle of a populated area, things became trickier. Little Toads got something between those ears, then Zabuza growled. I say we charge, Kakashi, Kimiko opined, staring hatefully at the mercenaries before them. By staying here, we are merely delaying the inevitable. We should send away Naruto-sama with a clone, and take matters into our own hands. Which would have been great, were it not for the fact that clones were remarkably fragile and unable to use chakra, unless they were shadow clones, and had a limited range of usability. Give it a little more time, he insisted. We won't be let down. His motley crew of colleagues eyed him skeptically. He knew Haku was eyeing him, even with that mask. But kept their tongues. Only Zabuza showed his frustration by growling. And then, just as Kakashi was about to call it quits, his own patience having been nearly exhausted, something blew up at the rear of the mercenary army. What the fuck? Zabuza yelled, even as a few more blasts tore through the mercenary army, which quickly began to lose its cohesion as panic set in. Who brought the fucking bombs and didn't say so? He roared. Kakashi let out a sigh of relief, even as Kimiko did the same. Both Konohanins exchanged a look of tolerant exasperation before nodding and sliding back into combat stances. Don't lose focus, he warned the two missing nin. The cavalry's just arrived. A gleeful laugh broke through the air then, even as a gust of wind blew up some dust around the defending shinobi. All of them raised their arms to shield themselves, cautiously waiting to see what had happened. As the dust died down, they were treated to a wonderful sight: a giant eagle, hovering just a bit off the ground. 3 people stood upon its back, looking all too pleased with themselves, though one seemed about to faint from embarrassment. Hey guys! Hikari greeted cheerfully, before jutting her thumb behind her. So, is this a private party, or can anyone join in? Kakashi chuckled as he gestured to Haku, who brought down the ice walls. Good timing, Hikari-san, he commended, before spying his 2 students. I see you 2 are back on your feet. Hey sensei. Kiba greeted energetically, seemingly recovered from his wounds. We're here to save the day. Hinata just nodded in greeting at the group, mumbling a shy greeting. Behind them, something else exploded, which caused Kakashi to raise an eyebrow. If that's not you, then who's blowing things up? He asked the other Uzumaki clanswoman. Hikari grinned fiercely. You know how Gado's got the daimyo in his back pocket, she all but purred. Kakashi nodded. Well, turns out the daimyo's soldiers weren't that happy with the arrangement. A mutiny? Kimiko asked, coming forward to pet the eagle. For some reason, she had always felt a close affinity to animals, even if she didn't seem capable of taking care of them. Hikari eyed her clanmate warily for a while, undoubtedly remembering her last encounter. Full-out insurrection, she corrected. They're calling for the daimyo and Gado's heads. Seems they're tired of being used as Gado's goon squad. That's too sudden, Zabuza spoke up then, instantly putting Hikari and Kakashi's students on edge. No way you managed to convince them out of the blue. Hikari glared at the missing nin, before catching Kimiko's nod. Confused by the turn of events, Hikari decided to just let it slide for now. She was about to respond, however, when Kiba decided to answer for her. Wasn't us, jackass. Kiba snapped, pointing at him. And what the hell are you doing being buddy-buddy with Kakashi-sensei? Zabuza glared right back. Right now, wondering if it was worth it, he growled, his hand reaching for his sword. He was stopped by Kakashi putting a hand on his forearm. They don't know anything about what went down, the masked Konohanin pointed out. Go easy on them. Zabuza growled throatily, but nodded and put his hand back down. My question stands: who managed to get those spineless cowards to sack up? He asked. The villagers, Hikari answered. They've risen up. Don't know how, don't know why, but it looks to me like our being here, fighting for Tazuna, really gave them a kick in the ass. Idiots, Zabuza grunted, before turning away. Kakashi glanced at the missing Nin. Leaving? Zabuza snorted. Love to, but I'm still one midget head short. I need me that mantelpiece. No. The sudden interruption of another voice to the conversation stopped the party cold, as the shinobi turned to see Naruto slowly getting to his feet, looking haggard and perhaps a bit beat up, but no worse for wear. He gave his allies a tired grin, but eventually got to his feet. No killing Gato, he said. Hinata eeped at the sight of her crush being so beat up, while Kiba and Hikari were much less restrained, tackling him not a hug. Kakashi gave a sigh of relief, while Kamiko closed her eyes with a satisfied smile. Only Haku and Zabuza did not join in. In fact, the taller of the two seemed downright irritated. I'd like to see you stop me from getting what's mine, shrimp, he dared, reaching for his blade handle. Almost immediately, the atmosphere stopped being one of celebration at Naruto's reawakening and one of imminent conflict. Everyone's hands seemed ready to either reach for a weapon or mold into appropriate hand seals. Even Hinata seemed ready to deliver a Juken strike at Zabuza. Not that this would be necessary, as Naruto rose a hand. You don't need to kill Gato, he said. Yeah, but it'd make me feel good, Zabuza said with a shrug. It's a matter of principle. And what do you think the good people of this country will do to him when they get their hands on him? Naruto asked. He hasn't done to you anything he hasn't done to these people 100 times over. Zabuza eyed the blonde brat warily. Then what's the difference between me gutting him now and these idiots killing him later? He asked. Closure, Naruto said, looking pale as he gazed at the destruction around him. He had been the cause of it, he knew, and he felt sick to his stomach for it. If his memory served, this whole area had once been the back alleys of a town block. Now, it was a barren wasteland, with debris scattered about. As though a tsunami had swept the entire place away. Naruto, Kakashi spoke up, putting a hand on his student's shoulder. I get what you're trying to do, but there is no guarantee that Gato will get a fair trial if he's caught by the villagers. Or even taken alive. Kimiko nodded. We have seen this often enough, she agreed. The oppressed tend to lash out against their tyrants when given the chance for vengeance. Then we need to capture him. Naruto argued. Enough, Kakashi said, tightening his grip on his student's shoulder. Gato's fate is not our concern, beyond whatever fate Zabuza has in store for him, he said. As part of our agreement in securing his help, I promised to leave Gato to him. Naruto stared up at Kakashi, wide-eyed. He seemed about ready to protest, but Hikari shook her head at him once, very firmly. This is the shinobi way, she said. Naruto didn't seem ready to accept that, but stayed silent for now. Kiba patted him on the shoulder in commiseration. For now, we should, Kakashi continued, before noticing something approaching them fast, one of his tracker dogs, Pakken. You're back. The rest of the shinobi turned to see the small pug, panting but unharmed. Found the old guy, he reported, much to the surprise of Kiba, Hinata, and Hikari. They'd never seen a dog talk. Even Hikari, who actually used wolf summons, had never actually spoken with one of her lesser summons. They just barked at her. The pug looked at the assembled shinobi, finally noticing there seemed to be more than before giving a very human-like shrug. It's not good. Kakashi eyed Naruto, whose expression turned blank, before nodding. Haku-san, could you and Hikari go with Pakken? He asked the masked shinobi. Said person turned to Zabuza for confirmation, which he gave by way of a silent nod. Very well, Hataki-san, Haku agreed. Hey, why do I have to go? Hikari protested. I want to fight, too, she made a show of winding up her arms. Because with the help of your summons, he nodded at the giant eagle which had been patiently watching the whole discussion, you can get there faster and get him out faster, safe and sound. Hikari pouted, but then nodded. Fine. Alright, mask boy girl whatever you are, she pointed at Haku, then Pakin, and Pancake Face. Hop on and let's go. Who are you calling Pancake Face, woman? The pug demanded indignantly, right before he was grabbed by the scruff by Haku and forced to join Hikari on her eagle. Within a moment, the eagle was back in the sky. Chuckling from Hikari's offbeat nature, which successfully managed to lift the mood a bit, he turned towards the fighting around them. On every flank, the enemy forces had split into the pro- and anti-Gato factions, and it didn't seem as though the fighting was about to die down. Now then, he said calmly, lifting his headband to reveal his Sharingan eye, even as Zabuza drew his blade and made a few, stretching moves. Kiba and Naruto, reading the mood, craned their necks and stretched their arms, while Hinata and Kamiko slid into ready stances, Byakugan and weapons at the ready. Let's finish this fight, shall we? Zabuza grunted. It's about fucking time. Urururu nearby Gato had a very simple motto for life. Dream big, live big. For the most part, he'd kept to that mantra quite faithfully. Despite being a native of Nami, then a backwater outpost of Mizu, he had managed to do right by himself by being cautious with his money and investing in all the right things. What had been a small fishing boat became a larger fishing boat. Then the fishing boat was worked by 2 men he'd hired to do it for him. Then the fishing boat became 2, and the crews and intake doubled. Then he opened his own stall at the market, and used the daily catch to sell under the usual market rate, causing his competitors to go bust. The wheel turned, and his dreams grew bigger. What was a simple fishing company eventually invested in cargo ships. At first, small ones, designed to bring Nami's products to Hai, then to Mizu. Eventually, his cargo ships reached all the way to Umi and Kaminari. Eventually, even the barbarians who lived further east had traded with him. Eventually, his trading business even included overland caravans, to the point where even the Tsuchikage and Kazekage had a vested interest in keeping his company around. Money ruled the world, and Gato was an expert at making money. So, alright, maybe he had dabbled in some illegal trade here and there. Blockade running for Eastern warlords, human trafficking here and there, maybe even some drug and weapons smuggling. Who cared? He wasn't hurting anyone important, and the world moved on. That was why, when he heard that Mizu was thinking of abandoning Nami to its fate, he had seen a golden opportunity. His company headquarters had been, at the time, located in Hai no Kuni's capital. However, his shady reputation had caused some court officials to begin questioning his continued stay, even if his company's continued business was still in high demand. Therefore, he needed to find a nice, quiet place he could settle down and rule his company without any major interference. And what better puppet than a bankrupt daimyo? So, yeah, he funded Nami's daimyo. Sure, he extracted unthinkable trading and security concessions. In practice, in fact, Gato effectively ruled over the island's entire armed forces. All 2,000 conscripts. Pathetic, but useful. Goons didn't need training to be violently effective, after all. As long as they knew where the sharp end went, and obeyed his every command, he didn't much care whether they were the Kaminari daimyo's renowned Thunder Brigade, or some idiot with a club. His calculations and plans were precise, far-reaching. He oppressed the people of his native country, sure, but at the same time he had known to leave enough breathing room for them to have something to lose. Desperate people made for dangerous foes, while bonds made them indecisive, fearful. So many plans, so much success. Gone. The moment he had seen the villagers flank his mercenaries from behind, where he'd stationed the daimyo's troops, he had known something had gone wrong. Yet, he hadn't been worried. Why would his soldiers be in any danger from a bunch of hicks with pans and rakes? Then a small boy stepped forward and began yelling at them. He'd almost laughed. Yet said laugh died in his throat when other adults joined him, and he saw the troops slowly change their expressions from grim resignation to resentment and finally, mutiny. He knew mutiny. No one who'd worked on a ship was unfamiliar with that look. Naturally, he'd fled immediately. His mercenaries were accustomed to dealing with shinobi, certainly, but he had also taken the time to equip and train the daimyo's troops for such combat, just in case he needed them to take care of Zabuza and other shinobis like him. However, it seemed as though he had gravely underestimated their discontent at being used as his personal death squads. Within moments of his flight, he heard the daimyo's troops charge the mercenaries, an act which was repeated on the other side of the encirclement. The daimyo's banners were thrown down, and, as he stopped to take a breath, cursing his lack of physical fitness, he saw the mercenaries completely collapse under the surprise attack. And then he heard explosions. He had given the soldiers explosives in order for them to have something to keep the shinobi at bay. Yet now, they were being used to tear his mercenaries apart. Perhaps that was the exact moment he knew everything was over for him in Nami. Even if he escaped here, even if he managed to reach the daimyo's palace, there was no trusting the remaining garrison, especially once they heard about what had gone down in this town. The daimyo would be hung for his tolerance of Gato, undoubtedly. His offices and warehouses would be ransacked, and he'd lose millions of ryo in lost merchandise. Yet he would be alive, and still quite wealthy. He could survive such setbacks, and indeed had backup plans for such situations. He hadn't built the empire he had by being some overconfident tool, after all. Right now, there was a ship he owned docked at the town's river port. Navigating the rivers that crisscrossed the island was the fastest method of getting around, and the prime reason he had been able to deploy so many troops as fast as he had. Therefore, he made a point of having a ship anchored at every dock in Nami to ensure that he had a way out if anything went belly up. Like now, for instance. He grinned as he saw, through the beads of sweat dripping down his face, the docks ahead. With all the commotion in the center of town, he knew that no one would be around here. Quickly, he made his way down the docks towards the small sailboat he knew would be there. Ideally, he'd have someone else manage it, while he rested. However, given the situation, that was unlikely to happen. Fortunately, he still remembered how to sail. Jumping into the small boat, he quickly set to task in getting everything ready, not for the first time finding his small stature a bit of a pain. He was just about ready to set sail, a surge of relief building within him, when he heard someone click their tongue. That wasn't possible. There was no one else around here, save himself. Slowly, the businessman turned around, and felt his heart figuratively stop. Sitting, easy as you please on the steering bench, was Zabuza, his gigantic blade hefted onto its shoulders, still dripping blood. The masked shinobi seemed a bit scratched up, and there were hastily crafted bandages adorning his shoulder, but no worse for wear. Leaving without saying goodbye, Gato, the masked shinobi rumbled. Zabuza. Gato squawked. But, the mercenaries. The fight. What, that? Zabuza nudged his head towards the fighting behind them. It got boring real quick. Figured the others could handle it, while I had a real nice chat with my favorite scumbag employer. Despite the situation, Gato couldn't help but feel indignant at the turn of events. He had paid the man. Paid him. There had been a contract, and Zabuza had failed to uphold his end. You were paid in full, Zabuza. Gato snapped. You did your job, and that was that. Zabuza's blade suddenly appeared at his neck, sitting just 1 millimeter away from slicing it open. The masked man clicked his tongue and wagged his finger at Gato reprovingly. Now, Gato. No need to get impolite. I thought we had a deal, Gato said through clenched teeth. Zabuza nodded. And we did right up until you were going to sell me out to Mizu, he said calmly. Or did you forget to mention that the moment I'd hit Mizu, I'd have Hunter Neen on my ass? Gato glared, furious at having been caught out. Yes, he'd planned to have Zabuza killed even if his reputation was shady. Gato had managed to avoid the stigma of outright murder throughout his entire career. People didn't like doing business with murderers. Therefore, the only way out he'd seen for this little quandary was to silence Zabuza. It wasn't personal, he grated out. There was no sense lying. He could see in Zabuza's eyes that he wouldn't believe a word anyway. Just business. Zabuza cocked his head sideways, his gaze firm. Yeah, he mused. So's this. Zabuza's blade retracted from Gado's neck just a bit, and in a flash, all Gado felt was an instant of sharp pain and blackness. Uraruru main town square Kakashi had been through his fair share of battles. When he'd been a boy, he'd participated in an actual war. Therefore, when he and his students joined the fray, aided by Kimiko, to him it felt like riding a bike. You could go out of practice for a bit, but once you got started, you fell right back into old habits. Keeping his steps fluid, he used his kunai to slice his way through the enemy ranks with astonishing speed, making sure never to stop for too long anywhere, to prevent what few archers remained to get a clear shot. More often than not, however, he was forced to cover for his students, who despite their advanced skills compared to the average genin, that is, were still acting rashly and showboating more than was wise. Fortunately, he didn't see them kill anyone yet, so he supposed that was a plus. The first kill was always hardest, and the younger the killer was, the more screwed up their minds became, if not treated fast enough. He knew he'd been there. Though, as previously stated, he hadn't seen Kiba, Hinata, or Naruto kill anyone yet. Hurt, yes, in fact, he was sure a few would never walk straight ever again, or be able to reproduce, but kill? Nah. Kimiko was another story entirely, however. The red-headed young woman tore through the mercenary forces like an infuriated angel unleashed. Her twin spears skewered, slashed, and tore with almost reckless abandon, were it not for the calculated movements he realized were behind them. An arrow had once nearly reached him, and in the middle of an upward slash, Kimiko had flipped her grip on one of her spears, locked onto the offending archer, and thrown the spear so powerfully that the man flew for a few meters before falling out of sight, the spear embedded in him. Fortunately for his peace of mind, however, the battle quickly resolved itself. Without Gado around to harden their resolve with promise of money, the mercenaries, who probably valued their lives over any contract, began to lay down their arms, to the rising cheers of the mutinous soldiers and rebelling villagers. But while his students joined in with the cheering, especially when Inari finally found Naruto and begged for his forgiveness for acting like a brat, Kakashi's attention was almost immediately redirected towards an incoming eagle. After making sure the army archers wouldn't fire, Kakashi walked over to the middle of the square, where the eagle landed. Pakken quickly hopped off, followed by 3 more people: Haku, Hikari, and Tazuna. Except Tazuna wasn't walking, or hopping, or anything. Tazuna was currently being laid on the ground by Haku and Hikari, the latter of whom looked grim. "He's alive?" he asked as he came near. "Barely," Hikari informed him. "It's bad, Kakashi," she admitted, seeing the celebration start to die down around them, probably out of curiosity over what was happening. If Sora was here, then maybe. She looked away, though Kakashi could spy a few tears forming at the corner of her eyes. He drew nearer and knelt by Tazuna, whose breathing was incredibly shallow. Eyeing the rest of the bridge builder's body, he spied the 3 areas where the arrows had hit him. Rather than being clean wounds, however, it would appear as though Naruto's rampage had basically caused the wounds to worsen. There was no medical craft short of a trained healer that could save him now. Sensei? Kakashi's eyes widened, realizing he had forgotten about his students. Turning, he held up a hand. "Hinata, Kiba, Naruto. Stay there," he ordered. "What's going on?" Kiba demanded, pointing to his nose. "I smell blood." Sensei? Hinata asked softly, feeling rather anxious at the way her teacher was acting. What could rattle such a seasoned warrior, after all? "Just stay there," Kakashi insisted, before turning to Hikari. "We've got to get him out of here." "This isn't the place for it's the old man, isn't it?" Naruto asked suddenly. Kakashi closed his eyes, cut in mid-sentence, and cursed softly as he heard Hinata gasp and Kiba swear. Then, moments later, the situation worsened. "Gee, Grandpa?" Well, if he'd wanted to spare Inari of the trauma of seeing his grandfather die in this state, he had now utterly failed on that end as well. A shot blur quickly reached Tazuna's other side and looked down at the dying man with tears rapidly forming. Inari grabbed his grandfather's arm and shook it. "Grandpa, wake up," he begged. "Come on, Grandpa. Why you can't he see can't." Whatever else the boy wanted to say was lost in his sobs as he latched onto his grandfather's arm. "Don't leave me," the boy sobbed. Kakashi turned his gaze downward, intellectually knowing that he was not responsible for Tazuna's death, but somehow emotionally feeling guilty as hell. He heard Hinata cry softly, while Kiba was sniffing quite intermittently. Naruto, for his part, just looked down. Perhaps, instinctually, the boy knew that his rampage had likely sealed the man's fate. Ironic. "Kakashi," Hikari said softly. The veteran Jounin looked up and saw that all around them, men and women from the village and the daimyo's troops had come near and were similarly mourning Tazuna's fate. The soldiers, less familiar with the man, closed their eyes and bowed their heads in respect. "Inari," a man spoke up, walking up to the weeping boy and gently laying hands on his shoulders. "I'm sorry, my boy." Inari just wept on, still firmly latched onto his grandfather's arm. "It's a damned tragedy," the man continued, looking at the bridge builder's dying body sadly. "But there's nothing that could be done." Apparently, those were the wrong words, as Inari stopped weeping. "Nothing?" he asked softly, before snapping his gaze back up to Kakashi and the other shinobi. "Nothing?" he asked again, a little louder. He pointed an accusing finger at Kakashi. "You were supposed to protect him," he yelled. "That was your job." Kakashi looked away, knowing the boy had a point. Yet, even if that was the case, he also intellectually knew that the situation had forced their hand, and saving Tazuna from public execution had been, in itself, a high-risk gamble. One that had both succeeded and spectacularly failed. Inari Hinata tried, only to be cut off by the boy's hateful glare. "No," he shouted. "You lied. All of you, you lied," he accused. "You said you'd keep him safe. Keep him from Gado. And what happened? He's going to die because of you. Because you couldn't just leave us alone." Despite his sadness at Tazuna's inevitable fate, Kiba started to flush angrily, prompting Naruto to put a hand on his chest in order to prevent him from doing anything rash. It was a jarring change, considering that a few weeks ago, it would have been Naruto who needed to be stopped from lashing out. "I hate you," the boy continued yelling, and Kakashi could see the villagers' mood start to darken a bit. It seemed that, in the absence of another scapegoat, they were rather willing to blame the shinobi for the death of so respected a figure. Already, Kakashi made plans to get his team out of there, blade swinging if need be. "I hate you. I hate." Smack. In a flash, Tazuna's free arm had lashed out and smacked his grandson upside the head. "Grandpa?" Inari asked, stunned at the sudden blow from his dying grandfather, and holding his head in pain. Tazuna sighed, before flinching in pain, slowly coming to once more. "Figures you wouldn't even let me die in peace," the old man grumbled. He flinched again. "Ah, crap, that hurts geez. Where's a bottle of booze when you need it?" "Tazuna," Kakashi spoke up. This wasn't exactly the way he'd imagined things would play out. Yeah, the bridge builder said resignedly. "I'm super screwed." "I can feel it," he said. "Ain't gonna live to see that super jackass Gato get what's coming to him either," he added. "Pity that would have loved to see that asshat suffer a bit." Weakly, the old man raised his arm and motioned to Naruto. "Oi, brat, Simir. I got words for you." "Grandpa, no. He got you killed." Inari protested. Tazuna snorted, and then flinched. "Right, ow. As if." "Damn it, Inari, where the hell did you get your brains from?" "'Cause it sure ain't from your mom," he remarked, before looking at Naruto, who silently knelt by his side, next to Kakashi. You. You open your ears and listen good, Naruto nodded silently. Tazuna glanced down at his wounds, from which blood was slowly leaking out more and more. This ain't on you. It's on the jerks who shot me. It's on Gato. It ain't on you. Naruto said nothing for a moment, before shaking his head. I should have protected you better, he said. Naruto, Kakashi started, hoping to comfort his student, before Tazuna snorted, yelping again in pain. Ow, fuck, the man cursed. You're damn right you should have, he said with a chuckle. But what's past is past. You took down Gato Hill. Ye freed my country. We're square. Naruto-sama, Kimiko said warningly. Naruto glared back at her, but this time, she stood her ground. To refuse a dying man's words is a grave insult. A man of honor listens to one who dies with honor. Naruto seemed surprised by the observation, then slowly nodded, turning back to Tazuna. You'll come, I guess. Tazuna barked out a laugh before yelping again in pain. Good lad. Tazuna-san, the Konoha shinobi turned to see a man wearing military armor approach the fallen bridge builder. Instinctively, Inari shuffled closer to his grandfather. Even if the soldiers had mutinied, no one had forgotten how they had done Gato's bidding for a while. The soldier seemed unfazed by the act, however, and bowed. I am Jin, of Clan Takayama. I lead these soldiers. I must ask your counsel. Tazuna eyed the soldier warily, then got into a coughing fit, which sparked alarm in Hikari as she tended to the wound. We're losing him, she warned. Grandpa. Kakashi looked at Tazuna gravely, before glancing back at Kimiko. Uzumaki-san, please take the genin and conduct a patrol of the area. We don't need any stragglers hitting us now, he ordered as calmly as he could muster. He then turned to the soldier. Whatever you've got to say it quick. Wait, Tazuna managed to gasp out, raising a hand to stop Kakashi from sending away the two Uzumaki clansmen. Takayama-san, I am just a carpenter. I have no power over you, or anyone else here, he said weakly, his skin becoming deathly pale with alarming speed. He managed to feebly point to Kimiko and Naruto before his arm gave out. The masked Uzumaki, as Inari's yells of denial grew in volume, Tazuna gave a rattling breath before his head lolled to one side, eyes closed. There was a moment of stunned silence before Hikari placed 2 fingers on his neck and, after a moment, sighed dejectedly and shook her head. He's gone, she declared. 3 days later, the great sage once said, the virtuous man is driven by righteousness. The inferior man, by profit. Naruto kept his head bowed as Kimiko stoically recited the funerary rites. Behind her, and surrounding the entire area, were Tazuna's fellow villagers and the mutineers who'd risen against Gato and the daimyo. All wore dark clothing, both men and women, adult and child. Many were crying softly, but none left. They owed Tazuna that much. Dressed in a Miko's uniform, Kimiko looked strangely common. That steely, sharp edge to her persona seemed a mere illusion right now, as she carried out her funerary duties with humility and veneration. Her fiery red hair was tied back into an unassuming ponytail, her head was bowed, and her hands were pressed together in prayer, the prayer beads dangling from her thumbs. Not once did she showboat, or turn to face the crowd. Her whole existence, at this moment, seemed dedicated to honoring the fallen. Honor is to the righteous man as air is to all life, she continued. And though he leaves the mortal realm today to rejoin his ancestors, Tazuna-san has nothing to fear as his ancestors laid judgment upon him, for his was a life dedicated to the good of the people of Nami. There was a stifled sob to his left, and Naruto afforded himself a peek. Inari was the most disconsolate of the group, and though his grandfather had asked him not to hold a grudge, Naruto had barely seen the boy in the 3 days following Tazuna's death. Every morning, he would go out, and every evening he would return for a silent meal, then go up to his room. His mother had tried to keep him close, but after he'd escaped for the third time, had given up. Ordinarily, abandoning his mother would have prompted Naruto to bop the brat on the head, but given the trauma he'd just gone through, Naruto realized he really didn't have any moral high ground here. Spirits of the Ono clan, a pang in his heart made Naruto wince. He had only learned of Tazuna's family name a day ago, when Kimiko had requested the man's lineage from Tsunami for the funeral. Like then, he now felt extremely guilty for not having bothered to learn even that simple fact about him. We come this day, the third day since the passing of your descendant, to commit his worldly body to the earth, which supports all life, to the air, which gives all life breath, to the water, which nourishes all life. 5 men then stepped forward, each carrying a lit torch. Tazuna's unmoving, pale face was illuminated by the fire's glow, as his body lay still upon the funerary pyre, dressed in white. Naruto watched Hikari, usually so cheerful but now subdued, strike a small drum rhythmically. Tazuna, of Clan Ono, Kimiko raised her voice just enough to be heard clearly over the drum. Today is the third day of your passage to the spirit realm. The day where your spirit returns to the world to look upon your descendants. Behold and listen to the loved ones who mourn your passing. It was like floodgates had burst open, as the villagers openly wailed. Finally, they had been allowed to let out their grief, and said grief was powerful. Empowered by the shame the villagers all felt, having left Tazuna alone in his fight against Gato, perhaps they now felt the need to make it up to the man. It was a striking scene for Naruto, who had never truly been party to a person's death, or funeral. His hand went down to his stomach, and he realized that this scene before him was perhaps the reason so many had disliked him in the past. It was one thing to know they hated you for the deaths of hundreds of people, even if it wasn't your fault, but that of your tenant. But it was another thing entirely to see and feel what those losses entailed. He looked to Tazuna's body, and bowed deep. Even in death, the old man had taught him a powerful lesson. A soft breeze blew through the town square, and Naruto could have sworn he saw Tazuna's mouth curl into a smile in the flicker of the torch's light. A trick of the mind, one might say. Perhaps so, but to Naruto, it was a sign the old man was here, even now. Tazuna-san, Kimiko then said, as the tide of wailing died down. Please watch over your descendants, and the many thousands of lives your actions will forever change. In the sage's sacred name. In the sage's sacred name, Hikari chorused, before nodding to the men with torches. 4 of them moved closer to the pyre, while the last one turned to Inari and Tsunami, and held out his torch. Kimiko turned toward Tsunami and Inari, and held out a hand. As Tazuna-san's loved ones, you must be the ones to free his body from the mortal world, she said, managing to even sound kind. Naruto could see Tsunami swallow nervously, while Inari seemed of a mind to refuse. However, his mother managed to quickly preempt that, as she thankfully took the torch with a short bow, and gently pushed her son forward, towards the pyre. Her steps were agonizingly slow, as she and Inari approached Tazuna's body. Even in the dimming light of sunset, there was no mistaking the tremors in Tsunami's grip, as she undoubtedly steeled herself for this final act of goodbye. Though she put up a brave face, Naruto had no doubts she was perhaps the one person in this crowd who was suffering the most. She had lost 2 husbands, and now her father, to Gato's greed. He felt someone tug at his GI, and turned to look to his right. Hinata was still crying softly, one hand covering her mouth as she stifled her sobs, while the other seemed to have unconsciously reached out to him for comfort. Naruto didn't know what to do, so he did nothing. Truth be told, he was in no place, emotionally speaking, to comfort anyone. Goodbye father, Tsunami managed to choke out, one hand finally clasping onto her mouth as she finished her words, letting out a strangled sob. Naruto watched as she lit the pyre near Tazuna's head, which was promptly followed by the other 4 torchbearers applying their torches to the rest of the pyre. As Tsunami stepped backwards, Naruto and the rest of the crowd watched as the pyre's flames took force in the soft wind, quickly building up into an inferno. He hadn't been very convinced by Kimiko's insistence that Tazuna undergo these funerary rites, and now felt even less convinced. This spectacle of violent burning didn't seem appropriate as a way to send off a kind man. The greater the flame, the greater the man, Kimiko announced as she raised her arms, seemingly having read his mind. Let all present bear witness to the fire of Tazuna's soul. Hikari's drum sounded out in the silence that followed, as all present continued to watch silently as the pyre's fire burned higher and higher. If the fire matched the man's soul, then Naruto had no doubts few present could match Tazuna's fiery spirit. The next day it spoke volumes of Tsunami's character that she did not kick the Konohanins out the moment her father had died. Or even after his funeral was had. Unlike her son, it seemed that she had taken his final words to heart, and had decided to place the blame squarely on Gado's shoulders, even if perhaps Naruto's actions had all but sealed Tazuna's fate. Still with a base of operations, then, Kakashi had kept his team resting in the house as he tried to sort out the emotional baggage his subordinates had now accrued. Hinata, the most sensitive of the three, would occasionally burst into tears. Kiba, trying to act like a man, had taken it upon himself to stoically weather his feelings, but there was no mistaking the repressed anger he felt during training, when he basically tried to tear everything apart. Even Akamaru seemed worried. Perhaps the most troubling one, however, was Naruto. Unlike Hinata's open expression of grief or Kiba's repressed anger, Naruto seemed to be lost in a deep melancholy. Perhaps an outsider might have thought Naruto's behavior was strange, or even fake, considering he'd known the bridge builder for less than a month, but Kakashi had met enough people throughout his life to know that Naruto's sadness was genuine. Unlike his other two students, Naruto was an orphan for most of his life, and so the child treasured every connection he made. Losing a connection, to a boy like him, would have felt like a punch to the gut just as harsh as if a clansman had died. But just as Tazuna's flames had risen high into the sky last night, it was his job, as a teacher, to make sure the flames of his student's soul didn't die out. He took a moment to reflect that Guy would have probably tried to man-hug him if he'd ever heard him say that out loud. Right now, however, was not the time to talk to them yet. He had to let them sort out the first few stages of their grief, and let them come to him. He had already expressed a willingness to hear them out, but he couldn't force it upon them. That would just backfire. So instead, he took some time for his own self-reflection, and kept the unusually demure Hikari and Kimiko company as they spoke to the mutineering soldiers. He had to admire Tazuna's quick thinking. The dying old man had seen an opportunity before him to rid the country of another source of corruption, the daimyo, and had saddled the only people suited to the task with the responsibility of carrying it out, the Uzumaki. A lot had come to light in the days after Tazuna's death. As the people demanded answers as to why it should be the Uzumaki clan to call the shots, Kimiko had been pressured to reveal the truth that Nami had once been Yuzu. The bombshell caused many an awkward conversation between the younger generations and the older ones. However, to Kakashi, that all proved Tazuna's moment of brilliance. Nami was a weak country, with a history of weakness and occupation. There was nearly no bright light in their history to give the people any sort of rallying cry, a way for them to feel proud of themselves enough to demand change. Gato had done wonders to build upon Mizu's campaign of historical devastation and make the people of Nami servile. But with this new heritage in the light, Kakashi had begun to observe a subtle, but sure change in the people of this town. The younger generations, perhaps driven by outrage, began speaking more boldly of change. The older voices, typically the ones to ask for caution, were beginning to be drowned out, or slowly joined their descendants. But whether or not the uprising was carried out now rested on the Uzumaki. Even in death, Tazuna had bestowed upon his old masters a great gift. Kakashi may not have been a fan of the Uzumaki up till now, but even he could see the benefits they brought with them to Konoha. However, their influence was, at this point, mostly one out of bullheadedness and seeming bullying. With no great actions to their name, it would not be long before the rest of the people in Konoha would believe them to be self-important outsiders, and rise against them. Like with the Uchiha. He didn't know whether or not Tazuna ever spoke to Naruto, Hikari, or Kimiko about this, but it seemed apparent not that he had. Perhaps he thought of this as his way to return the favor, for having protected him and playing a key role in the Konoha team staying to fight. If so, it was a magnificent move, and Kakashi would honor Tazuna's memory forever for this brilliant act. We have word from 4 more towns that their garrisons will join our rebellion. The man in charge of the mutineers, Takayama Jin, informed the 2 Uzumaki women while he gestured appropriately on the map between them. I still think we can count on the capital garrison, but by now word of our rebellion will have reached Daimyo Kurosawa's ears. Kimiko and Hikari exchanged looks, seemingly feeling quite out of place in this conversation. Kakashi couldn't blame them, both women were warriors, not strategists. Even if Tazuna had entrusted the fight to the Uzumaki, these 2 were the wrong Uzumaki. We have also seized Gado's warehouses here, and here, Jean continued, seemingly unaware of the women's discomfort. In total, we have enough weapons to arm our rebellion and then some. The greatest risk we face is his militia, and they seem to have lost all cohesion. Have you found Gado yet? Kimiko asked, finally finding a topic within her expertise. Jean shook his head. We still have men scouring the region, without success. However, a ship was found at the dock bearing signs of combat. We believe someone may have preempted us and killed him. Kakashi had a fair idea as to who, though he supposed he wished they had let the businessman live. Like Naruto had said, the people here needed closure, too, and robbing them of the chance to exact justice on Gado would likely drive many to extremist beliefs. Haku's gone, Kakashi spoke up then, reminding the rest that he was still there. Left as soon as the fight was over. Then Zabuza remains our prime suspect for the disappearance of Gado, Jean stated. Only the slight clenching of his fists betrayed the inner frustration he undoubtedly felt. We had a deal, Kakashi said unapologetically. He got his revenge, you got your freedom. Jean said nothing, but it was clear that he didn't much like said deal. Kimiko was equally silent, prompting Hikari to take the lead as she smiled at the rebel commander. Takayama-san, why don't we take a break, she proposed. I'm sure you've had a rough time getting everything in order. Kakashi watched Jean flush a bit, then nod. Thanks to this novel experience, Kakashi had learned that Hikari wasn't the ditzy bimbo she liked to act as. Sure, she was skilled in combat, he knew that already, but she'd never given much indication of her skills off the battlefield. Only now had he had a chance to see her in action. The first indication was the funerary rites. While Kimiko was the true shocker there, he had no idea she was considered a trained Miko in the Uzumaki clan. Hikari had also proven knowledgeable of such customs, helping her clansmen carry out the ancient Yuzu funerary rites with utter professionalism. Brains and brawn. He could see why the Uzumaki were so feared. Their versatility put many experienced shinobi to shame. And now, Hikari was working to put the rebel leader at ease by tending to him. He had seen her accompany him on walks throughout the town and listening to him. Whether or not the affection was mutual seemed unimportant to the young woman, who quickly switched personalities when she was with Naruto and the rest of the team. Once she and Takayama left, Kakashi realized he was left alone with Kimiko. He'd never had much luck connecting with the young woman, however, so he made to leave. Thank you. Kakashi froze in his tracks. Had he heard her right? He turned to look at her, and saw her staring right at him from where she was kneeling on the floor. Thank you, Kakashi-san. Kakashi was flabbergasted. Not that I don't like being thanked, but for what? He asked. Kimiko looked away, a sad smile somewhere. Kakashi was sure, a pig learned to fly gracing her regal features. I have been a source of constant discord among the team since we left Konoha before, she admitted, and he was hard-pressed to disagree. But you have tolerated me well enough, despite your misgivings. Thank you. Kakashi didn't know what to say. He couldn't, after all, admit that part of the reason he hadn't just sent her back packing was because an order from the Hokage was law. Still, he had to concede that after getting to know her, even just a little, he had learned to tolerate her bullish ways. You're welcome, he settled for saying. Kimiko's sad smile grew larger by perhaps a millimeter before she looked away. Some advice before we return to Konoha. Kakashi raised an eyebrow. She had just apologized for acting self-important and now she was doling out unsolicited advice. The women of the Uzumaki clan were inscrutable indeed. Remain close to Naruto-sama, she said, slowly getting to her feet. He's unlike anyone I've ever known. I know what you mean, Kakashi said wryly. It was half true. The boy had more of his father and mother than he knew, but he seemed to know how to balance zeal with honor better than most adult shinobi he knew. With respect, no you don't, she said sternly, but with none of the fierce zeal she usually showed when defending her clan. She looked up at the ceiling. I've seen and done enough to know that honorable idiots are a dime a dozen, Kakashi-san. My clan is full of them, and I can tell, even at his young age, that he is different from that. She turned to look at him, and he saw nothing but seriousness there. He reached me when no one else could. He stood his ground, when others would have fled. He endangers himself for the sake of honor, she said, before looking away. Give him a few years, Kakashi-san, and he will be a legend. As Kimiko left the room, Kakashi couldn't help but be struck by her words. Unlike previous times she'd gone off the rails to defend the Uzumaki clan, this time she'd expressed herself seriously, calmly. She spoke of the future with a certainty few could ever truly have. He'd known that, given his heritage, Naruto would never settle for being an ordinary shinobi, of course. However, perhaps now his student merited closer observation. He sighed as he scratched his head. Man, debriefing back home was going to suck. A week later Naruto was grateful to his teacher for delaying their return home. Even though Gato was officially gone, no one could find him, and no one seemed to know whether he even still lived. Naruto had insisted that they stay for one last task, finishing Tazuna's bridge. Though the rebellion against the daimyo had officially begun, Naruto had felt that the most important thing was to finish the work for which Tazuna had given his life. The soldiers couldn't help out, for obvious reasons, but Naruto found widespread support amongst the town populace. Like himself, he supposed they felt this would be a good way to memorialize Tazuna's legacy. Thankfully, the old man had finished most of the structure before passing away, meaning that there was remarkably little left for the Konoha shinobi and the village to do. With the help of Naruto's seemingly unending supply of expendable clones, progress on the bridge was quick and efficient. As a result, it was soon time to go, and Kakashi had decided that the best time to do so was after the bridge's inauguration. As he stood amongst the crowd of townspeople with his teammates, he watched as they proclaimed the bridge the Great Ono Bridge, as per his own insistence. He'd heard that there had been talk of naming it the Great Naruto Bridge or Great Uzumaki Bridge, but had campaigned for the old man's recognition instead. As far as he was concerned, his own contribution had been more damaging than helpful, and even if his clan helped the people of Nami in their revolution, it made more sense that Tazuna be recognized for lighting the spark. Thus it was that Naruto and his team bade goodbye to the people of Nami. Firm, solemn handshakes and bows were exchanged, words of encouragement and gratitude as well, and Naruto even spied the man called Jin give a more tender goodbye to Hikari, who later insisted the entire thing had been a fling to ease the man's stress. He took her word for it. Things like romance fell way outside his knowledge bubble. Ironically, it seemed that their return to Konoha was a much more somber affair than leaving it. Perhaps due to the death of Tazuna, and the mixed victory they'd achieved. Yeah, that was probably it. The nights camping out didn't really help, either. Lacking Tazuna's boisterous laughter and funny stories, Kiba and Naruto settled for basically teasing each other and provoking mock fights to fill up the night air with some form of sound, other than crickets. After a few minutes of basically making fools of themselves, however, they would just return to their spots and stare at the campfire gloomily. Kimiko and Hikari, for their part, were discussing something over by their side of the camp. Well, Naruto said discuss, but it was really Kimiko making short statements and Hikari arguing back. Still, it was a marked change from a week ago, when Hikari basically did as Kimiko said, without question, and with more than a little fear. Hinata was the real wild card. Sometimes she seemed pensive, sometimes she seemed sad, but as far as the trio of Kakashi's students were concerned, she seemed to be the one holding it together the best. At the very least, she didn't seem to need to provoke a fight to keep her mind off things. Her attitude made him curious then again, what didn't? Prompting him to approach her on their second night on the road. "Hey Hinata-chan," he greeted the shy Hyuga heiress, having approached her after the adults had left to scout the perimeter. He'd managed to get Kiba out of the way by prompting the boy to groom Akamaru, who to be fair had begun to stink. He didn't really need the Inuzuka heir out of the way, but this wasn't exactly a conversation he wanted others to interrupt. The pale-eyed girl looked up from the dishes she was washing and eeped in surprise at his presence. Even though they had basically been teammates for almost a month, she was still prone to bouts of shyness and exaggerated surprise whenever he was around. Still, it had gone down a bit, which Naruto was adamant to consider a win. "En Naruto-kun," she greeted, blushing the moment she apparently realized her hands were wet and full of soap scum, while her jacket was rolled up to the sleeves, because she quickly grabbed a towel and dried off her hands, then rolled her sleeves back up. Naruto didn't know what the fuss was about. He'd gotten way dirtier cleaning his house. He plopped down next to her, prompting another shy eep. "Hinata-chan, do you mind if I ask you a question?" he asked her. The girl's eyes widened, giving Naruto an interesting view of her pale eyes, as the reflection of the campfire's flames flickered in them. Sure," she agreed almost immediately. "I know Kakashi, Hikari, and Kamiko are all used to this sort of stuff, but how are you dealing with Ino?" He suddenly felt his words fail him. It still somewhat hurt to talk about Tazuna. It reminded him too much that he'd failed. Hinata blinked, then she smiled sadly and looked away. It was a look he'd never seen on her before. For a moment, he thought he might have unknowingly insulted her. Hey, to be fair, he had zero experience with women, alright? And quickly rose his hands to apologize. She didn't give him the chance. "I lost my uncle when I was very young," she told him. Naruto blinked. "Uncle," he repeated dumbly. Hinata still wouldn't meet his eyes. "You Uncle Hisashi," she clarified. "He died when I was 3 years old. A bad man had come to kidnap me, and my father killed him." Naruto blinked. That seemed more like a tale about her dad had single-handedly been a kick-ass savior, rather than the story of her uncle's death. The man was from Keikumo. She turned to face him, and for once, Naruto didn't see nervousness or surprise or happiness in her eyes, but true sadness. The type he'd seen in the mirror every time he looked into one during his early years. An important man. They demanded retribution, and we agreed. Naruto's eyes were the size of saucers. He shot to his feet, outrage plastered all over his face. "But why?" he demanded. "They're the jerks who tried to take you away." Hinata looked up at him in surprise, then back away, sadly. "Because otherwise there would have been war, Naruto-kun," she explained. "A life for a life, and no one else had to die. That was the deal." Naruto was about to protest even more fiercely, when he realized something in that story didn't click. She'd said her father had been the one to kill the Kumo asshole, but at the same time, he also knew her father was very much alive and kicking, so if Kumo had gotten their blood for blood bullshit carried out, then her father couldn't be alive. "My father and Uncle Hisashi were identical twins," she provided the final piece of the puzzle for him, the look in her eyes telling him she knew where he'd been heading. He got there all right. Just like that, it made sense. There was no way a village like Konoha would hand over a clan head no matter how much of a douche they were. Even as isolated as his childhood had been, he'd been able to pick up a few things about clans, and the first thing he knew is that the clan head was basically like the supreme honcho of the family. For some of the more douchey families, that meant that everyone but the clan head was expendable. And the Hyuga, present company excluded thank ramen, were the biggest sticks in the mud in all Konoha. Bar none. They sacrificed him, didn't they? He asked, teeth grit and hands curled into fists. He suddenly had the urge to high-five said Hyuga clan head. In the face. With a chair. Repeatedly. Hinata confirmed his theory with a sad nod, her gaze drawn back to the campfire. I don't remember much about that day, but I do remember the sadness I felt, she told him. Uncle Hisashi, I don't remember him much, but when I think of him, I feel happy. So I know he cared for me. She sighed and looked at him with a rueful smile. I killed my uncle, Naruto-kun. Now that was a screwed up way of looking at the whole thing. From where Naruto stood, Kumo and her dad were the ones who'd done fucked up. Kumo, for being the jackasses who tried to kidnap a toddler, and her father, for sacrificing his brother because Kumo had a temper tantrum over getting caught. He all but slammed a hand onto her shoulder and gripped her in what he imagined was a tight but reassuring squeeze. No, you didn't, he told her forcefully, staring down at her sternly. Hinata, you were too. The guy who killed you uncle was that jackass from Kumo. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise, he insisted. Hinata blinked and flinched a bit as his grip on her shoulder tightened for a bit, but then looked away and nodded. Letting her go, Naruto gave a self-satisfied huff and plopped back down next to her. Good, he said. Know what's that got to do with Tazuna? Hinata looked back at him, blinked, and realized they'd gone way off topic. Oh well, seeing Inari-kun and Tsunami-san, and the others at the funeral reminded me of Uncle Hisashi, she told him. So I remembered what father told me back then. What was what? Naruto asked, wondering what good advice some prick who sacrificed his own brother could possibly give. She smiled at the sky, then. It was a striking image to Naruto, as the flickering flames from the campfire illuminated her face, giving her an almost angelic look. He didn't even notice when Kakashi, Kimiko, Hikari, and Kiba returned. All he heard were her words. Heaven favors none most than those who give their lives for family. For days later, Konoha's massive gates loomed in the distance, and yet Naruto still couldn't shake off the melancholy that had pestered him since the mission in Nami went cockeyed completely. Yet, after his talk with Hinata, he had begun to feel a bit better about things, though he couldn't get rid of that pestering, criticizing inner voice that kept telling him he was, in the end, the one at fault for Tazuna's death. Even if Gado's men had shot him, it was his actions that had led to the old man's injuries worsening. At the same time, if he had just protected Tazuna better, then he wouldn't have been critically injured to begin with. Upon their return to the village, Naruto basically went through the motions as his team reported in to the Hokage, who seemed pleased and displeased by the outcome. On the one hand, as Kakashi had pointed out, they had failed to secure the survival of their client. However, at the same time, they had managed to evict Gado and initiate a high-friendly rebellion among the natives that would see a pro-Konoha and pro-high government sweep into power, if Konoha played its cards right. The politics went way over Naruto's head, but the gist of it was, according to Hinata, that Konoha ended up winning if they just sent some discreet help. His return to the Uzumaki compound was a riotous affair, of course. Flanked by Hikari and Kimiko, Naruto returned to a hero's welcome, as his clansmen all congratulated on what they presumed was a successful mission. Naruto wanted to correct them, but Hikari had urged him to keep quiet until the elders had a chance to talk to him. So Naruto waited and endured. He smiled and shook hands, told a few vague stories from the mission, and waited until the elders were ready to receive him. When they were, virtually all of the other clansmen had basically passed out from drinking and partying. It never really struck Naruto how inappropriate his clan could act until right now. He supposed he now kinda understood how outsiders, and their neighbors the Hyuga clan might feel. Sitting atop a dais, Hayako and Keisuke observed the trio of Uzumaki clansmen they dispatched to Nami. At the forefront was Naruto, still uneasy with the concept of sitting still for prolonged periods of time. On either side of him, a few steps back, were Hikari and Kimiko, both of whom were more at ease with the situation. Then again, They had lived with this sort of thing all their lives. So, a mixed victory, Keisuke summarized, head bowed. Kimiko had finished her report, and the elders knew to trust her word on these things. Yes, Keisuke Koro, Kimiko agreed. Naruto shot her a look. He was still uncomfortable calling this a victory of any sort. It implied Tazuna's death was irrelevant. A pity about Tazuna-san, Hayako weighed in. Though he has granted us a bigger boon than I think even he could have ever imagined. Keisuke nodded. Cat's out of the bag now, he said. Soon, everyone from Mizu to IWA will know of the rebellion in Nami, and its connection to Yuzu. The rebels want an Uzumaki present to take charge, Hikari butted in then. Their leader believes that without our name to provide legitimacy, the people will be more reluctant to back the movement. Naruto's frown deepened. This conversation was getting too complicated for his liking. Rebellions? Politics? Bah. Give him a straight-up fight any day of the week. There were less complications involved when one's sole mission was to plant one's fist in another's face. Akemi would be a good choice. Or Maki, though I fear she's not really ready for a war, Hayako pointed out. Keisuke nodded. Ideally, it would be, he gave Hayako a significant look, prompting a sigh. Unfortunately, she has yet to agree to bring her cell back into the fold, she pointed out. Naruto perked up. A lost cell? That got his interest. After all, both of the geezers had made it abundantly clear that the greatest service he could do for the family was bring it back together. Why not? He asked. Both elders gave a start, as though just now remembering he was there. Naruto couldn't blame them. He'd basically let Hikari and Kimiko do all the talking, only filling in here and there. Keisuke began slowly, obviously wondering how to put this delicately. Shuko eyed. Hayako was more direct, though she, too, seemed uncomfortable discussing the absentee elder. Keisuke snorted. That's one way to put it, he said. Naruto glanced back at Hikari and Kimiko, and was surprised to see Kimiko deliberately avoid his gaze, while Hikari seemed to be holding back a laugh. Even by Uzumaki standards, Shuko is an oddity, Hayako tried to explain. She's the youngest of us elders, but second to none in her wits. Frankly, I imagine the Nara would love to have her. There was a pregnant pause then, before Keisuke turned to Hayako slowly. Can we? No. As Keisuke grumbled, much to Naruto's amusement, Hayako cleared her throat and continued. Shuko is physically weak, so she's made a name for herself based on her mind, Hayako explained. This has led to some eccentricities. She's a grown woman with a childish mind in a childlike body, Keisuke said bluntly. But whose mind also happens to be fit for the greatest strategist in the world. And a fondness for pranks, Hikari mumbled under her breath, though Naruto was able to hear her. He felt a grin grow on his face, as he realized that perhaps he may have found someone in the clan who shared his love of a good joke. In short, she's a disciplinary nightmare, Hayako said, giving Hikari the evil eye. Obviously, the young woman had failed to keep her comments as inaudible as she'd hoped. But she commands great loyalty among her cell, and throughout the clan. It helps that she's the only one-cell leader who hasn't had to move her group in decades, thanks to her strategies, Keisuke pointed out. Naruto grinned at last. She sounds awesome, he exclaimed, getting to his feet. How do we get here to come here? The very thought of that seemed to horrify the elders, while Naruto was sure he'd heard a snort coming from Hikari. Here. Hayako squeaked. Keisuke raised his hands placatingly. Naru-chan, I understand your willingness to reunite the clan, but having Shuko here, Naruto swept out his arms. Why not? She sounds fun, and like you said, we need someone in Nami, right? She sounds perfect for the job. You said so yourselves. Keisuke and Hayako exchanged looks. Well, I suppose that's true, Hayako conceded. Keisuke palmed his face. Heaven shook here. Naruto ignored the negativity, feeling his spirit re-energized now that he had a solid goal to work towards. So, how do we get her cell to come back? He asked. Keisuke and Hayako exchanged looks again, before the female elder motioned for him to explain. If I may, Koritachi-sama. Kimiko spoke up then, suddenly. All eyes turned towards her. Both elders looked immensely grateful for Kimiko's intervention and nodded. Naruto watched Kimiko rise to her feet and walk over to him, still managing to tower over him intimidatingly. Still, this time he felt no threat from her. Naruto-sama, I know Shuko-sama probably best, aside from the older members and the elders, she informed him. If it's about earning her loyalty, then it is a simple enough matter. Her left hand blurred, and before he knew what happened, Naruto was being poked in the forehead by Kimiko, who bent down to look at him. Shuko-sama's strength is her mind. Therefore, she will only submit to one who can beat her mind, she said. Naruto was already regretting his big mouth. When he'd said that he wanted to bring back Uzumaki Shuko into the fold, and her cell with her, he'd thought he'd have to do something a bit more physical. Maybe defeat 1,000 enemies. Build something. Hell, he was fine with a marathon. But strategic thinking? That was for other people. People not named Naruto. His head snapped back then, as he was suddenly flicked in the forehead by Kimiko with astonishing strength. If he hadn't known his cousin, he might have thought she'd punched him. Regardless, he was now on his rear, looking up at Kimiko, who bore a look of complete seriousness. And that, Naruto-sama, is why you must lose. Naruto blinked. Huh? A week later Kakashi had noticed something strange about Naruto. In short, he sucked. Well, okay, not sucked, but certainly underperforming. Ever since their return from Nami, Naruto had begun acting a lot less capable than his sojourn abroad had suggested. His moves were sluggish, thoughtless, and undisciplined. His every waking moment seemed dedicated to annoying the hell out of his teammates, or acting like a hyperactive 6-year-old. In short, he sucked. Which was weird, because Kakashi knew the loud-mouthed blonde was much more capable than this. He had seen him in action and Nami had seen him stand up to Kimiko, Gadahel, to odds even an adult might have balked at. Yet here he was, as though Nami was but a dream, and this were the real Naruto. He'd spied Hinata and Kiba eyeing Naruto like he'd suddenly gone crazy, so he knew he wasn't alone in his concern. Or so crazy he'd dreamed up Naruto's action throughout Nami. Heaven knew if he had, Inoichi would have had him committed. The radical shift in attitude made Kakashi suspicious, of course. As a shinobi, he knew better than to just take this sort of heel turn for granted. There was always a reason behind such actions, and though he couldn't think of a plausible explanation, he could see that even Naruto's companions and his own fellow jounin were beginning to question the blonde's ability. To what end, he wondered. He brought his concerns to the Hokage, of course, and while the old man had initially seemed worried, a follow-up meeting the next day had seen the old man assure him everything was under control. That only served to make him more suspicious. When the authorities knew something was wrong, but did nothing, then it meant one of two things, usually. One, the authorities were inept, which he knew not to be the case. Or two, there was a scam going on, and the authorities were in on it. The latter seemed the more reasonable deduction, so Kakashi had tried to follow Naruto home once, hoping to see whether any training time he lost with his companions were being made up behind the clan's walls. Unfortunately, the Uzumaki were every bit the seal masters they were known as, and so it proved impossible to infiltrate the compound. Not without having to bust out some serious Fuin skills he didn't have. Still, it didn't sit well with him that no one had told him about any plan involving his potential star student becoming an idiot overnight. He had plans for Naruto. The trip to Nami had proved to him that, out of all his students, Naruto may well be one of the finest he could have. While his potential for theoretical knowledge remained atrocious, his practical learning curve was off the charts. Still, The Hokage's refusal to share details told him he was to remain out of the loop, which usually meant that someone was watching, and they, whoever they were hoping that he would play the part of the frustrated teacher. Well, then, he would oblige. During training sessions, he would chide Naruto openly for his childish behavior, making sure to act as naturally as he would in these situations. He didn't need much creative thought before the Genin pool. He'd already tried teaching other teams, all of whom had failed the bell test. All he did now was channel that frustration into basically making Naruto look like the dead last of the Genin. He could have sworn he's caught a thankful look from Naruto once, right after being on the receiving end of another lecture. But well, while the idea of making Naruto seem as inept as possible seemed to be working, it presented Kakashi with another problem: the Chunin exams. The idea was that, since the Genin under his, Asuma, and Kurenai's command had successfully pulled off at least a C-class mission, his own team mission to Nami being ranked A, all things considered, the Jounin had agreed to at least let the Genin try out for the Chunin exams. None of them actually thought the kids had a shot in hell. It was almost inconceivable that they would actually reach the rank, with just one C rank A rank under their belts, and a whole lot of D ranks, but they figured it would be a good learning experience. The problem was, he and Naruto had done such a good job of making him look like an idiot that now no one in their right mind would agree to partner up with him. And neither of his colleagues looked too enthused about putting such a liability in any team. Of course, when he told the Hokage, the old man had chosen to play dumb and inform him he had no idea why he thought Kakashi should sabotage Naruto's performance. Of course, he subsequently failed to take disciplinary action, which meant he had wanted him to do this. Except he also refused to get involved and force a team to happen. Sometimes, he really wished he could strangle the infuriating old man. Now it was Asuma. Great. Sakura, Naruto, Sasuke. Danzo would flay us alive for putting Naruto and Sasuke together, Kurenai pointed out, before thoughtfully adding, and they'd probably kill each other in the first 10 minutes. Kakashi felt like killing something. Anything. A fly would do at this point. Shikamaru, Naruto, he said, sort of expecting Asuma to protest at this point. Thankfully, he seemed alright with it thus far, so he soldiered on. Sakura. There was a pregnant pause, which Kakashi hoped would not result in another protest. That might work, Kurenai conceded. Shikamaru's smart enough to get them through the brainy bits, and Sakura's no slouch either on that end, Asuma agreed. Naruto good for cannon fodder, I suppose. A little unfair of the man, but then Kakashi had to admit he'd basically dedicated the past week to ruining Naruto's reputation. With Naruto's tacit consent, of course, and that of the Uzumaki clan. Otherwise, he was fairly sure they'd have made their discontent painfully obvious. At the very least, he'll be able to protect his comrades while they formulate the winning strategy, Kurenai said more fairly, though Kakashi could only partially believe that. Clearly, the betting pool regarding Naruto's chances were going to be very, very slanted. He made a mental note to bet big on his student. So we're settled, right? He said, motioning for the waiter at the bar to refill their glasses. Picking the other teams would prove much easier now that the most difficult one was taken care of, but after the marathon debate and team-choosing session, he needed to get wasted. Fast. No more objections. He wished his Jounin colleagues weren't as jaded as they were, so that he could unleash enough killing intent to make them cower in acquiescence. Fortunately, such reckless behavior was averted by the two Jounin nodding. Hopefully they'll do all right, Kurenai said, nodding in thanks to the waiter who came by with new drinks. I'd hate for them to take their loss too hard. They'll bounce back, Asuma assured her. They're tough kids. Kakashi nodded and brought up his glass. To middling success, then, he toasted. May they lose well. A screwed-up toast? Absolutely. But then, this had been a screwed-up week already. Unknown, 5 days later, Shuko-sama, a messenger has arrived for you. Uzumaki Makoto remained kneeling as he watched a small arm rise from a bundle of something behind the screen door. To his discomfort, the Uzumaki who'd greeted him here wherever here was had brought him directly to Uzumaki Shuko's private residence, not the meeting hall. And from what he could tell from the discarded clothing and general mess of things, Shuko was about to wake up. At 3 p.m. "Ma, what is it this time?" a girlish voice asked from behind the screen door. It became readily apparent to Makoto that the clan elder wasn't about to pay the usual protocols any respect, so he brushed aside any slight he might have felt from the lack of decorum. "Shuko Koro, I am Uzumaki Makoto," he introduced himself, bowing until his head touched the floor. "Respectfully, I bring a message from Keisuke Koro and Hayako Koro." An unfeminine snort arose as the bundle of something shifted behind the screen door. "What do those two killjoys want now?" "They wish to ask you for your return, Shuko Koro," Makoto said diligently. "And that of your cell. They wish for a reunion." The bundle wobbled as Shuko's laughter filled the air. Makoto had expected this, or rather, Keisuke and Hayako had warned him as much, so he endured the laughter. "And why would I do something boring like that?" the bundle asked amusedly. "Is it because of the clan head?" she preempted his argument. "The so-called savior of our clan? I hear he's just 13 years old. Why should I put my family's well-being in his hands? Naruto-sama has the family's best interests at heart. Naruto-sama is also, I hear, quite stupid." The bundle stopped moving. All of a sudden, Makoto felt the whole room suffer a severe drop in temperature. "They say his team's accomplishments in Nami were in spite of him, not because of him. They say he is a liability to his contemporaries." "Unfair characterizations, Shuko Koro," Makoto said simply, sticking to the script he'd been given. "My spies confirm this," Shuko's voice informed him. The bundle shifted again, and the chilling feeling was gone. "Go back to the old farts. Tell them to stop grasping for a lost dream. Or at least to leave the rest of us alone. It's getting annoying, you know." Makoto was silent, remaining kneeled on the ground. He had been told by Keisuke and Hayako that Shuko might be difficult, and so he would need to keep his composure and stand his ground. "I'm sorry, I must have not spoken clearly enough," the bundle spoke again. The chilling feeling was back. "You can leave now." "What if?" Makoto spoke up just then, practically cutting her off. "What if we can prove Naruto-sama is worthy of following?" There was a moment of silence before the bundle snorted again. "What if people could live forever?" she mocked. "We can wish all we want, Makoto-kun. That doesn't mean fairy tales come true." "Keisuke Koro and Hayako Koro respectfully disagree, Shuko Koro," he said. "And they wish to propose a bet." The bundle shifted. "A bet?" Shuko asked, sounding interested. Makoto's gaze sharpened. It seemed they had been right. Despite her extreme intelligence, Uzumaki Shuko tended towards recklessness whenever she thought she had the upper hand. That, and she loved to bet. "Indeed," he nodded. "A bet. As you know, the Chunin exams are coming up, and Konoha is slated to host them this year," he told her. The bundle shifted angrily, if that was possible. Of course, of course. Get to the bet." Makoto remained calm. This was the crucial part, he'd been told. "If Naruto-sama is capable of passing the exams, will you agree to a reunion?" There was dead silence again, and the bundle shifted no more. For a moment, Makoto feared he may have failed, that he may have pushed the envelope too hard, but then there was a snapping sound, and the screen door slid down into the ground, and from behind the bundle, revealed to be a really untidy bed, walked out what Makoto could only believe was a 12-year-old child pretending to be an Uzumaki elder. Or he would have, if he hadn't spied the purple gem on her forehead. Uzumaki Shuko. Despite her childlike appearance, there was nothing about this woman that screamed innocent or harmless. Her every move seemed calculated, and her gaze betrayed ageless wisdom that belied her childish appearance. As a shinobi, Makoto knew this was not a woman to cross or underestimate. No one went up against the Uzumaki clan's fabled grand strategist and lived. Keisuke's become a desperate geezer, she said, her voice sounding as girlish as her actual appearance. One hand played with the wing ornaments she had on her head, while the other was rubbing its fingers together. Interesting. She snapped her fingers. Then again. Then again. Finally, she smiled. You're on. 5 days later, CE, 25 days, I'm going to kill him. Shikamaru sighed as Sakura ranted once more about their newest teammate. Ever since the Jounin had basically coerced them into agreeing to participate in the Chunin exams 5 days ago, he was sure they felt they had just been persuasive, but as far as Shikamaru was concerned, making them work harder was simply coercion. Shikamaru and Sakura had been saddled with what they both perhaps thought was the oddest, most annoying, and overall inefficient team combination they'd ever imagined. Namely, they had been partnered with Naruto. Now, minor meltdown and flashbacks to the Genin test aside, Shikamaru wasn't that against pairing up with the blonde. He knew Naruto was a well of untapped potential, and he, like the rest of the Genin, had seen him break out some kick-ass moves in the days leading up to their first C-rank mission. However, it was for this very reason that Shikamaru was now utterly flummoxed, because the Naruto he'd been paired up with sucked. It was like someone had flipped Naruto's learning switch to off, and everyone around him had left him far behind. Even the Uzumaki's techniques seemed to fall short, as Kiba, whom Naruto managed to beat and fight to a draw in the past, now easily destroyed the blonde in just a few moves. Sasuke just needed the one. It made no sense. There was no logical reason for this. Or, he had to grudgingly admit, none that he could think of right now. His initial thought had been that Naruto might be deliberately making himself dumber, but deceit only worked when there was a target and Shikamaru could see none on the horizon. Was he trying to deceive the Hokage? Kakashi? Kurenai? Asuma? The other Genin? His own family? Why? For what reason? Unlike his ranting, pink-haired teammate, Shikamaru wasn't as willing to write Naruto off completely. He knew, or more accurately, he was convinced that his hyperactive teammate was hiding out his abilities, burying them under a veil of incompetence. Even if the reason for it escaped him, there was no reason why this sudden lack of ability would exist. It just made no logical sense. He picked up his glass of water and took a drink, eyeing his new female teammate. He was still undecided as to whether or not Ino had been a better teammate, all things considered. Give it a rest, Sakura, he said when he put down the glass. To be fair to Sakura, the girl probably had the most cause to be infuriated with the blonde. Unlike Shikamaru, she had no clan to fall back onto if she failed as a shinobi, nor did she envision any career outside being a shinobi. While Shikamaru was content being a middling chunin, at best, he knew Sakura had much more lofty ambitions among them, being worthy of Sasuke's love. And catastrophically failing the Chunin exams, which Naruto's presence threatened to do, was likely the worst-case scenario for her. The glare she shot him as they shared their meals said it all. "Why aren't you mad?" she demanded. "He'll ruin everything." Shikamaru was really regretting this outing. After having been forced together into 3 teams, Shikamaru had suggested that each new team take the time to get to know each other. Thus, Ino, Shino, and Kiba were holding their own team outing. Hinata, Choji, and Sasuke were out on theirs, and Shikamaru, Sakura, and Naruto had their own thing. Or they would, if it weren't for the fact that Naruto disappeared after every training session, ostensibly to go back to the Uzumaki compound. That left Shikamaru to bond with Sakura, except she took these outings as a chance to vent. Shikamaru sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Naruto isn't that simple, Shikamaru defended his wayward teammate. He often wondered why he bothered. I know you know that. We all saw what he was capable of before the mission to Nami. Sakura glowered, but said nothing, huffing and sitting back against her chair. Clearly a fluke. Shikamaru doubted that. Maybe if it was once or twice, but he used to give Kiba and Sasuke a run for their money, remember, he pointed out. That kind of skill doesn't just vanish overnight. Sakura was still glowering, but he could see the gears working in her head. Maybe he was knocked too hard on the head during his teen C rank? Even then, I doubt Kakashi-sensei would have overlooked such brain damage. Sakura groaned and rubbed her temples. This is giving me a headache. Again. Shikamaru could empathize, if not sympathize. He knew full well how irritatingly annoying Naruto could be, and the headaches he caused with his unpredictability. Yet, Shikamaru was convinced there was no other logical explanation for his sudden decrease in ability other than deliberate deceit. I think he's purposely holding back, he told her. Ordinarily, he would have just stayed silent and watched things develop. However, given that Naruto's actions could impact his own well-being, he needed to be looped into the plan, or else his own plans could derail everything. Furthermore, he knew Sakura had a decent head on her shoulders, a far better analytical mind than, say, Ino or Sasuke. Sakura's gaze sharpened, though he could see the disbelief in it. What? Why? She asked. Shikamaru shrugged. Haven't figured that part out yet, he admitted. Sakura huffed. I think you're being optimistic. Naruto's skills aren't the only things that suck. His reflexes are horrible. You can't fake reflexes. Shikamaru knew that was true. Even if you could slow your timed responses, the body's instincts weren't something you could fake. If you saw a punch coming, your body's instinctive response would be to dodge, or soften the blow. Naruto didn't do either, not even excruciatingly slowly. It was like every sense of self-preservation and perception had been stripped from him. Maybe, he conceded. However, he's going to be our teammate, whether we like it or not, Sakura, he pointed out. That means we either believe in him, or we carry him. But whichever we choose, we need to work together. Sakura grimaced. I know. Shikamaru nodded, then realized that people around them were whispering and pointing at them. Looking around, he saw Sakura and he had caught many a person's attention, which seemed odd. What was so interesting about them? The answer soon came in the form of a portly waitress holding up a pitcher. Would you love birds like a refill, dears? She asked kindly. Sakura went bright red, while Shikamaru gaped. What? Sakura asked, flushed with embarrassment. The waitress seemed quite confused by their reaction. I apologize, did I say something wrong? Unwilling to stand by while Sakura brutally murdered the poor woman, Shikamaru quickly regained his senses. I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake. He gestured at himself and Sakura, are not here on a date. Definitely not on a date. Never, in fact. Sakura added. Shikamaru thought that was a bit unnecessary, and maybe a little hurtful, but let it slide. The waitress looked surprised by the revelation and raised a hand to her mouth in shock. Oh. To apologize. It's just, your reservations. Shikamaru had a bad feeling about this. What about them? Why did he have a feeling he was about to join Sakura in trying to murder Naruto? Well, they were specifically made for Mr. Nara and Ms. Haruno to celebrate their 1-week anniversary. Dead silence enveloped the restaurant. Then, all at once, an enraged female yell with the force of 1,000 suns ripped through Konoha. Naruto. Inuzuka compound, 3 days later, CE, 22 days, Kiba struck the training pools with increasing ferocity as Akamaru watched on from the sidelines, the puppy whining in concern as the violence of his strikes increased with every hit. In all fairness, the puppy was probably right. Kiba's hands hurt like hell by now, but he was determined to keep striking, keep hurting, until the rage finally left his heart. The cause of that anger? Naruto. Kiba felt betrayed by the blonde Uzumaki. During their mission to Nami, he'd felt he'd come to share a fraternal bond with Naruto, who was very much like himself in many ways. They both shared a rough sense of justice, and though Naruto was far more reckless than Kiba, the Inuzuka heir had felt a kinship with the guy. He'd even felt for him for his role in Tazuna's death, and had lent quiet companionship during their mourning period. Yet all of that maturity, all of that skill, all of the commitments the blonde had made in Nama were all gone. The Naruto he had trained with in Nami was able to hold both Hinata and himself at bay by himself. Sometimes they won, sometimes Naruto won. However, they were on par equals. They were united in their desire to fight for the common good. Like a pack. Yet not a day after they had returned from Nami, Naruto had changed completely. Gone was that rough maturity. Gone was the desire to work together as a pack. He seemed more intent on enjoying himself and making a fool of everyone than training, and that pissed Kiba off more than anything. With a feral roar, he hit the training pole hard enough to make it crack. Or maybe those were his bones. He couldn't tell anymore. The anger in him was almost at fever pitch. Just thinking about Naruto made his blood boil. In a pack, a selfish member was to be expelled, for the good of all. Naruto was being selfish, but Kiba had seen him be selfless beyond comparison. That contradiction ate at him, and made him question his course of action. I thought I heard something break. Kiba spat on the ground, not even bothering to turn to face his older sister, Hana. By common Konoha tradition, Hana was the clan heiress, not him. However, just because he had the support of most of the clan, he was considered the unofficial heir. Whatever. Stupid old men playing at stupid things like politics. The only way to really decide a leader was by a contest of strength. "What do you want, Hana?" he asked roughly. There were no formalities within the Inuzuka. All under the clan head were equals. Like in a pack. "Just came to see if you'd done something stupid to yourself," she said idly. He heard her steps come closer. Which, by the looks of that hand, appears to be the case. Kiba heard Akamaru whine and bark, and glowered at his partner. "Leave it be, Akamaru," he said. "She's got nothing to do with this." He raised a fist to keep striking the damaged pole, but was stopped by a firm hand on his shoulder. "Akamaru's right," Hana said. "Your hand is broken, little brother. You need to get it looked at." Kiba glared up at his sister, who remained impassive. He knew there was no way he could take her on, so he relented and dropped his fist. "Fine," he snapped, grabbing his fur-lined coat and throwing it over his shoulder. Only now was he realizing his hand really did hurt. He supposed he should be grateful to Akamaru, or else he might have pulverized whatever was left. "Whatever this snit you're in is," Hana spoke up as he started leaving. "Get over it, or use it. Don't wallow in it." He stopped in his tracks. He tried curling his free hand into a fist, but the pain was such that the most he could do was just make it shake angrily. "What do you know about it?" he snapped. Akamaru whined in concern next to him, nipping at his pants and trying to pull him away. He ignored the puppy. He couldn't see Hana, his back facing her and all, but he knew she'd crossed her arms. She always did so when she was pontificating. "Alphas don't hold grudges," she said. "They act. If something is making you lose control, either ignore it or defeat it. You keep acting like this, and you'll never be anything more than a pup." Kiba's anger flared within the Inuzuka. The idea of remaining a pup was unacceptable. While it was tolerated for children to be immature and reckless, as all animals were in their infancy, all Inuzuka were raised to value and work towards adulthood, as puppies, while cute, were nonetheless liabilities to the pack. Thus, to be called the Inuzuka version of immature brat was a stinging recrimination. The problem was, Hana was also right. Even through the stinging pain of his broken hand, he could recognize he was acting out, like an immature pup. He had a problem Naruto who was insulting his honor, and that of Tazuna and the others who died in Nami. Thus, he either sacked up and took care of the problem, or he ignored it. Of course, he didn't want to kill Naruto. Hurt him, yes, but not kill him. And since fighting was not allowed outside of the training grounds, and the teachers would be there to stop him from really teaching Naruto a lesson. He would have to save up his strength, his anger, for a more suitable stage. The Chunin exams. All of a sudden, his hands started to hurt a little less. Hyuga compound, 4 days later, CE 18 days. Hinata sometimes really hated living in a family whose eyes could literally see through everything. The obvious drawback being that there was no privacy. Thus, when she once again softly cried herself to sleep the previous night, several of her clansmen had noticed, despite her best attempts to not bother anyone. And, for having a heart, she was now apparently weak. Why had she cried herself to sleep? Well, contrary to her earlier life, it wasn't because of the way her father was pitching Hanabi against her. Nor was it the snide comments several of the main branch elders kept throwing her way, knowing she would be unable to not hear them. No, the source of her constant sadness was one Naruto Uzumaki. For the life of her, she could simply not understand what had happened to the boy she admired. Despite sharing a nice moment on their way back to Konoha, and she was sure she'd reached him with her story in some way, he had somehow reverted to being an obnoxious, untalented fool. Not that she'd ever say as much out loud, and even just thinking that way made her sick to her stomach. Yet, there was no denying what was in front of her. Naruto's skills had decayed atrociously, almost overnight. Naturally, she refused to believe any of it, even though she could see him lose to Kiba and Sasuke, and even the less physical members of the Genin pool, with depressing ease. She insisted he was probably pulling off a prank, a joke. Her mind was constantly awhirl with an infinite amount of possibilities that would justify why a talented boy like Naruto would suddenly become the class clown again. None of them made sense. She leaned against her bedroom's wall and looked out the window, towards the high wall that separated her clan's compound from the Uzumaki. Even with improved wards and all sorts of silencing jutsus, she could still hear and feel the buzz of constant activity on the other side. She envied that. The Hyugas were, by comparison, a depressing lot. Everyone had their place, and were expected to stay there. The maids got up, did their chores, went to sleep. The warriors trained, did missions, went to sleep. Potential clan heirs, like herself and Hanabi, were expected to either be training, doing missions, or learning the ins and outs of the clan's affairs. Then go to sleep. In short, a scheduled, rigid lifestyle. A lifestyle she was sick of, and truly wanted to change. She had tasted her first chance at a different life in Nami, with Kiba and Naruto. Unlike Niji or Hanabi, the two were bundles of concentrated energy, almost always willing to help out and have fun. Yet they also took the time to train not because it was their duty, but because they wanted to get stronger. They had goals, ambitions. They challenged their natural place and worked to overcome any difficulties that might stand in their way. She admired that. To someone like her, whose life was almost entirely planned out from beginning to end, the idea of breaking from the mold and striking out as her own person was like a shining star, and she'd had the privilege to meet two such stars. So why did one of them lose its shine? She knew Kiba was suffering in his own way at the seeming heel turn performed by their friend. But whereas Kiba channeled that suffering into anger, Hinata was simply heartbroken. Naruto's energy and confidence had been a guiding light for her all these years. Even before they had become genin together, she had taken strength from his bullish persistence to succeed, no matter the odds. He was her role model, and in Nami, he and Kiba had helped her gain a bit of self-confidence. Enough that even her clansmen had noticed. Yet right now, she could feel that confidence slipping away. Had she truly misjudged him? She refused to believe so, but with so much proof mounting with every passing day, she felt even her unshakable belief in him waver. Only waver, mind you. Because no matter how much her confidence shook, her belief in Naruto was as solid as the mountains of Kyumo. Hokage's office, 3 days later, CE 15 days. As it turned out, not everyone was happy with the ousting of Gato and the rebellion in Nami. Of course, Hiruzen had never actually condoned the rebellion, but that was beside the point, as far as international politics were concerned. All the other nations cared about was that Konoha Shinobi had directly participated in the disappearance of a major financial player Gado and destabilized a foreign nation Nami. That the latter had been a completely accidental byproduct of the former was irrelevant. Of course, this brought quite the headache for Hiruzen, and not just because of foreign criticism. The daimyo of Hai's court, in particular, had yet to cease sending him missives that were demanding explanations that he wasn't comfortable giving. Ordinarily, regime changes in foreign nations were the product of years of planning and groundwork. There would be multi-generational infiltration that would slowly and deliberately shift popular opinion towards the influencing nation, and the inevitable regime change would take place without too much fuss. At least, that was the Hai way. It had served the largest of the elemental nations well for the past few centuries, and there had never been a reason to change it. Except Kakashi and his team had managed to land a completely unplanned for rebellion on his desk, and now half the world was up in arms over it. The implications were obvious. Kiri was protesting because, despite having abandoned the island decades ago, it felt like the loss of nominal control over the island was a blow to their prestige, which was severely lacking, what with the ongoing civil war and all. IWA, for its part, was simply lodging a protest to test the waters. If Konoha folded, it would assume that there was a lack of political will to back up their commitments, and would likely seek out regime change in neighboring countries not yet allied to it. Kumo was by far the most dangerous of Konoha's critics. Unlike the other great villages, it had stubbornly refused to abide by the disarmament clauses of the last Great War's peace treaty. As far as his spies and Jiraiya's spies knew, Kumo was armed to the teeth, and eager to use its power to expand its sphere of influence. Perhaps the least worrisome voice was Suna. Though it had protested Konoha's intervention in a foreign country's governance, Suna was still Konoha's ally, and had made no move to change that. Most likely, the Kazekage needed to remind the other great villages that Sunagakure was still a major power in its own right, independent from Konoha's agenda. Still, Hiruzen knew he would have to smooth over some ruffles there. He'd heard Suna was having economic problems, so perhaps trade concessions could be negotiated to make sure Konoha wasn't ganged up on in the near future. Which also left the problem of what to do with this situation. With the rebellion in Nami in full swing, he couldn't very well withdraw Konoha's support, after having let his men basically overturn the ruling powers. Even if he did, the daimyo of Hai wouldn't wear such a decision, and would likely send his own troops, complicating the matter to a whole new level. On the other hand, he couldn't just ignore the other villages' anger. If he did so, he risked provoking them into action, and while another great war was unlikely, Hiruzen knew it would mean more border skirmishes. He did not want to have to deal with pointless body bags. That left a summit. The only way to deal with Kumo, IWA, Kiri, and Suna, all at once and without possible misunderstandings that could arise from long-distance messages, was a summit. The problem was the Chunin exams. It would interfere with the only acceptable time for the summit to take place. It also forbade him from leaving the village, meaning it would have to take place here. Which opened a whole other can of worms. If he was supposed to host the other Kages in Konoha, he would have to make concessions. Major concessions. They would each have to bring their own guards, and there would likely be small armies camped just off Hai's borders just in case treachery took place. Not enough to conquer a country, but enough to cause some damage while the real forces gathered. Which naturally meant all missions would have to be cancelled during the summit, in order to concentrate all of Konoha's available forces along the border and in the village itself. Though the Kages each respected the others, there was nothing close to resembling trust between them. Hiruzen sighed and rubbed his forehead. Kakashi had meant well, but his actions, and that of his team, may have forced Konoha into a corner Hiruzen didn't believe it could leave unscathed. Even if he called Kumo, IWA, and Kiri's bluff, he would have to make some agreements the daimyo might not like. And while Hiruzen was basically king in his village, the daimyo was his king. There was another problem, of course, the Uzumaki. There was no arguing that Uzumaki Shiobakure's former regnant family was a huge boon to Konoha. Their seal masters had managed to plug some serious gaps in Konoha's defenses, and he was informed by Ibiki that the village's wards were at their strongest. Their sheer numbers had boosted Konoha's martial ability. Not enough to rival Kumo, but enough to remind the other villages not to cross them. The problem, however, was that he had let them in on the basis that their pros outweighed their cons. And for a while, that was completely true. Now, however, he was starting to face an opposite situation. While the Uzumaki's return would have been an impossible secret to keep for long, if at all, Hiruzen had expected the clan to lay low and let the world get used to their return to prominence. Instead, they were direct participants in, if not outright supporters of, the Nami crisis. Which unfortunately meant that all of their old enemies had come out of the woodwork to start raising hell over their return, and Konoha's decision to integrate them. On the flip side, he was fairly sure none of his contemporaries were in any position to support the Uzumaki's enemies. In fact, he was fairly certain that, at the very least, Anoki would hate being pressured into making any decision. That meant he had some leeway for when they met. The question was, would it be enough? Nico. Here. Hiruzen didn't have to turn to know the ANBU operative in question was indeed standing behind him. They had a bad habit of doing that, but it was something of a tradition. Mystery and reputation building and all that. Inform the commander that I want his 4 finest agents in my office by tomorrow morning for a high-priority diplomatic op, he ordered. Yes, sir. In a split second, Hiruzen could no longer feel the young woman's presence, leaving him alone with the 9 other ANBU operatives who remained as part of his personal guard. An unnecessary arrangement, but one that had been instituted as a result of Minato's unfortunate death. Sighing, he took out his agenda and wrote in a couple of appointments. Sure, he could have just told his secretary outside, but Hiruzen felt that these small touches helped one keep one's mind together, especially in old age. The first appointment was with the Nara clan patriarch, Shikaku. He would undoubtedly be of great help in analyzing how best to deal with the fragile diplomatic situation they were facing. The second was with the Uzumaki. Unknown, 10 days later, CE, 5 days, Aya and, game over. You lose. Groans filled the room as Shuko once again trounced her opponents. The ward board set up in the Uzumaki compound's central hall was a haphazard of figurines and building blocks, set up to resemble this time around a seemingly random village. Shuko's pieces had the village's central building surrounded, and her opponent's units littered the side of the table, discarded after having been defeated. Her own forces were relatively intact. Yay! Another win for me, she exclaimed happily, if somewhat childishly. Clapping greeted her statement as her clansmen congratulated her for the win, a daily occurrence in Shuko's cell. Shuko-sama's brilliance puts us to shame, one of them told her as he bowed to her. Shuko grinned and walked over to her opponents, who immediately lost their looks of defeat and bowed to her. Shuko-sama, they intoned. Thank you for your guidance. Shuko waved them off. Mop you go, you 3. The 3 clansmen straightened up, but never lost the rigidness of their posture. Shuko sighed. Sometimes, her clansmen were far too uptight. She didn't know why she herself loved fun and games. You did well, she told them with a smile, all noise dying out to listen to her. She had that effect on her clansmen. No matter how young she appeared to be, or how childishly she sometimes acted, no one in her cell could deny her abilities. Do you know why you lost? One of the 3 bowed. Please. Enlighten us, Shuko-sama. Shuko frowned. She would have rather preferred it if they had at least tried to think about it. She was about to answer them when another voice interrupted. Miki-san, you were too hasty. In so doing, you left Hiro-san and Yun-san behind, creating an opening in your formation. Shuko smiled and turned, recognizing the speaker at once. Toshi-chan, she greeted her favorite clansman, bouncing over and all but spear-tackling the younger woman with a hug. Fortunately, said younger woman's taller physique allowed her to remain on her feet, as she tolerantly allowed the cell leader to hang off her midriff. Instead, Uzumaki Tashiko fixed Shuko's opponents with a stern glare. "It's all well and good to seize victory when possible, Miki-san," she continued, ignoring the fact that Shuko was now rubbing her face with her cheek. Her other clansmen were sweat-dropping, of course, but Tashiko paid it no heed. "However, if your attempt goes against the plan you and your allies agreed on, you will only sow confusion and chaos in your ranks. Any tactic must be HMPH." She was summarily cut off by Shuko kissing her on the lips, to everyone's surprise. Said kiss was over quickly, however, leaving Tashiko a red-faced, blubbering mess, while Shuko smacked her lips and grinned at the audience. "Cherries. Shuko-sama." Tashiko protested as she regained her senses. "Please stop doing that." Shuko pouted and poked her index fingers together. "But you were ignoring me, Toshi-chan. Your students needed to learn their mistakes." "But I want to play." The other clansmen watched the ping-pong-esque debate with time-worn, tolerant weariness. Despite her brilliance and age, Uzumaki Shuko had the maturity of a hyperactive 12-year-old girl whenever they weren't in a serious situation like combat or war. This personality quirk would surface especially hard whenever her younger clansman, Uzumaki Tashiko, would come around. Having learned by now that the rest of the day was wasted, the Uzumaki clansmen slowly left the building, each returning to their own task, until only Tashiko and Shuko were left. Toshi-chan," Shuko said, cutting off another of Tashiko's rants about propriety and unacceptable behavior amongst family members. "Play a game with me, ah?" Tashiko blinked at the sudden request. She would have thought Shuko would press the issue of going out and playing, but it seemed that the Uzumaki elder was intent on playing a round of the same wargame she had just won. "You'll win," Tashiko pointed out. There was no humility on her part, it was just that self-obvious. Shuko nodded. "I need to think," she explained. That was never a good sign. Shuko in thinking mode meant something was weighing on her mind. Something that could affect the whole family. Without a word, Tashiko went over to the war board and reset the units before going to her side of the board. She watched as Shuko walked over to her side and grabbed her unit moving stick. Without a word, Shuko made the first move. Tashiko was silent for a moment before moving a piece into position. In a split second, Shuko made her own. Clearly, she either already had a plan, or was acting recklessly. The former being obviously the most likely situation. "May I ask what weighs on you, Shuko-sama?" Tashiko asked as she moved another piece. Shuko was silent and moved her own piece to counter Tashiko's move. For a moment, Tashiko thought Shuko would just brush off her question. "You know that we are going to Konoha in a few days for the Chunin exams, ah?" she asked. Tashiko nodded. She had personally overseen Shuko's luggage and arrangements for the trip. She was also to accompany her during her stay in Konoha. "Yes, Shuko-sama. We will be ready to leave upon your order." "I made a bet," Shuko said, seemingly ignoring her comment. "You fear it will not go your way?" Tashiko deduced, making another move on the board. It was quickly countered by Shuko, and Tashiko lost her first unit. "I fear I may have been like Miki-chan," Shuko explained. "Reckless." Tashiko frowned. True, that was a character flaw that surfaced from time to time in their esteemed elder, however, it was rare enough to be unusual. She moved a piece, and consolidated her defense. "May I ask why you think so, Shuko-sama?" Shuko frowned and moved another piece. It made no sense, going away from the main objective. Keisuke and Hayako are betting everything on this boy, Naruto. Tactic hide. The potential clan head. According to our spies, an immature, untrained brat, Tashiko recognized. Tactic shield wall. Pass. Shuko pushed another unit on the board opposite from one previously moved and once again used her hide tactic. Another odd movement. Tashiko briefly wondered if her mentor was even paying attention. There was no way she could flank her defensive arrangement. The geography wouldn't allow it. Nor would she be stupid enough to be drawn out into an ambush. Exactly, Shuko agreed. But why would people as smart as those two bet everything on someone as useless as that? Tashiko's gaze sharpened. You think it's a trap? Shuko was silent for a moment, her gaze showing her true age as decades of wisdom beheld the war board in front of her. She had the look of a master strategist now, not that of a 12-year-old child. Maybe, she conceded. If so, I have walked us right into it. Tashiko could now see why the elder was so troubled. If she was right, then her fellow elders had taken advantage of her reckless nature to sucker her into an unwinnable bet. Smart, if underhanded. Then what are we to do, Shuko-sama? Shuko smiled for the first time since their game began, and raised 2 fingers. I call tactic double march. Tashiko blinked, taken aback by the elder's sudden return to the game. In a moment, Shuko shifted her 2 hidden units down well beyond their usual movement range, parallel to the geographical features that made Tashiko's defenses practically impregnable, and hit the rear of the fictional village, easily overpowering its defenses. Brilliant. Now, if Tashiko tried to backtrack and stop Shuko's flanking units, her frontal forces would decimate her by striking them while they retreated. Game over. Nah, Toshi-chan. Shuko shouldered her unit-moving stick and grinned. A trap is only a trap if you don't know about it, you know? Tashiko watched the Uzumaki elder look down at the board, proud of her newest victory. All signs of her melancholy and thoughtfulness were banished, replaced with confidence. The confidence of 1,000 battles fought and won. But once you do, it's just a challenge. Konoha Uzumaki compound, 4 days later, CE, 1 day. It seemed ironic to Naruto that, at this moment in time, the self-proclaimed prankster king of Konoha was the one person in the entire village who least wanted to prank someone. Yet there was no denying it right now. Arguably, he hadn't been able to pull off a good joke in a while, what with training and Nami and all that, so he'd been sort of happy to be able to cut loose when he got back. But if that fun came at the cost of losing his friend's respect, he wasn't as enthused. Before his family had resurfaced, Naruto could not remember having anyone to turn to or talk to other than his classmates, and even those interactions were severely limited. Regardless, they had been the first ones to acknowledge him, even if out of annoyance. So was it fair for him to deceive them, like they were the enemy? Sitting on the porch of his new house one he had all to himself apparently, he watched the rest of the clansmen walk down the dirt roads of their compound, still working and building as they continued to set things up to their liking. Even after a month at it, there were still many families who were sharing a home. He had offered to help, and did on occasion, but for the most part he was told that his own studies came first. But what good was it to be a clan head, if he couldn't help out? He waved at some of the children who ran by, waving crazily at him and greeting him. He felt like an old man, and he wasn't even 13 yet. How screwed up was that? Naruto-sama. Naruto didn't even bother to turn as Kimiko addressed him. The redhead enforcer of the clan's discipline had taken to officially staying with him ostensibly to better guard him. He'd tried to protest, on the grounds that Kimiko surely had better things to do than to guard him, but she and the elders had none of it. It was another one of those things he had to get used to, clan traditions and all. It was sort of starting to grate on his nerves. Yo, Kimiko-chan. Takashi-kun has sent word that he will be letting you take the day off, in anticipation of tomorrow's event, she informed him. There was a moment of silence before Naruto heard Kimiko's soft footfalls, until she knelt in Saiza next to him, looking out at the busy road. Something is bothering you, Naruto-sama. Naruto almost snorted. You didn't have to be psychic to know that. I'm fine. Lying to me is counterproductive, Naruto-sama. Naruto sighed. I really wish you'd just call me Naruto, Kimiko-chan. And I would prefer you didn't lie to me, Naruto-sama. Silence descended upon the two as they watched the busy road across the small garden. I don't like your plan, he suddenly spoke up, having decided to just get it all out. I don't like lying to my friends, Kimiko-chan. He heard her give a soft sigh. I am aware of your objections, Naruto-sama, she said. It was true this was hardly the first time in the past month he had become melancholic and despondent about his task. Yet it remains our best course of action to defeat Shuko-sama. Naruto scowled, turning his attention back to his older clansmen. And why do we need to deceive family anyway? Kimiko bowed her head, her stoic expression giving way to her own form of melancholy, he supposed. It looked weird on her. Kinda like she was constipated. Shuko-sama cannot be convinced by feats of heroism or arms, Naruto-sama, she said. I must have defeated 20 of her champions in the past during similar conditions as right now, and she would still refuse to a reunion. She sounds like a stubborn old hag, Naruto muttered, looking away and back to the road. Kimiko was silent, then made the briefest of strange noises that Naruto only belatedly realized was a restrained laugh. She can be difficult, she conceded diplomatically. So why do we want her? Naruto asked. If she thinks so low of family, maybe we should just ask the other clansmen what they think. Such a thing would be unthinkable, Naruto-sama, Kimiko said immediately. Herself, all of ourselves, we have only survived as long as we have thanks to the leadership of our elders. To ask them to betray their leader's trust would be catastrophic. Even if it's for family, he asked her archly. Have you forgotten, Naruto-sama? Kimiko asked him as she got back to her feet slowly. Naruto looked over and saw a mix of regret and longing as she spoke. She is family too, and family does not betray family. Kimiko, he tried to speak up, but she was already turning to leave. Ordinarily, that would never happen. She was much too attached to the idea of propriety and protocols to ever interrupt the clan head. Whatever it was that was eating at her, it must have been painful. Takashi-kun may have give you the day off, Naruto-sama, she spoke up quickly. But that does not mean you should slack off. Your seals will come undone tomorrow, when it is too late for Shuko-sama to try to shift the odds back in her favor. She turned to him, and he could see the same steely resolve he'd seen in her eyes back in Nami make a resurgence. So ready yourself, Naruto-sama. As of tomorrow, I'm afraid there's no going back. Naruto slowly nodded, and she left him to his devices. Turning back, he sighed and raised his right hand, channeling some chakra into it. There, on his wrist, he could see the 2 lines of characters that circled around his wrist appear. The one nearest his hand was pitch black, with the symbol for 1 firmly wedged in the middle. The one underneath it was barely visible anymore. Chakra Sealing Fuin. Ordinarily used for prisoners, Keisuke and Maki had applied the tattoo onto his arm at the beginning of the Chunin exam preparations, right after they had made the bet with Uzumaki Shuko. It had been decided, with Naruto's reluctant consent, that since it was unlikely the future clan head would be able to control his chakra flow to appear the fool, it would be best to seal away his ability to access as much chakra as they could without physically or permanently harming his pathways. It hurt like a bitch whenever he got the urge to bust out 100 clones, but it kept him in line. Only Takashi, Keisuke, and Maki had the ability to temporarily lift the restrictions, which they only allowed for his training sessions with Takashi. Given that, he had spent most of his time with Keisuke and Maki, who did their best to teach him Fuinjutsu, though without much luck. Unfortunately, he just didn't have the attention span to sit around and learn things. They'd come up with a possible solution a few weeks ago, but even with the help of his clones, it was a slow-going process. Nonetheless, he found himself looking forward to his last class before the exams. At the end of one of his training sessions a few weeks ago, Maki had announced that she had found a sealing style that would fit his combat style best. The lines on his wrist began to disappear into his skin once more as he let go of his chakra. A small, mischievous smile crept onto his face. In a sense, he realized, this could be considered his greatest prank yet. Everyone, from Shikamaru to Hinata, was so underestimating him right now that the moment the seal failed, he would likely cause their jaws to drop. In fact, His little run-in from before with those Sunanin, wherein Sasuke was forced to intervene, had done wonders to make even the foreign shinobi underestimate him. Though, to be fair, that guy with the raccoon eyes made him a bit nervous. His stomach, in particular, had felt really wrong while the boy's presence. As though his furry tenant had become agitated. So, in recap, he had one more day of playing the fool, before the Chunin exams were underway. His friends all thought he was useless right now, and his great-aunt, Uzumaki Shuko, had no idea of his real skills, thinking he'd be a worthless candidate, while his opponents had been treated to a scene of absolute incompetence from his part, meaning they would think him a pushover. And the only one who knew just how false that was him. He grinned. Suddenly, things weren't looking so bad. Konoha. Later that day, the guards at the western Konoha gate were, once again, the infamous Eternal Guardians, Izumo and Kotetsu. Without a doubt, the two had to have some of the worst luck amongst the entire Chunin Corps. Whatever they did, one or the other would somehow screw up and land the two of them into gate guard duty once more. Honestly, Izumo was beginning to think that perhaps he should just revise his job title to gate guard and be done with it. Of course, it didn't help that his friend and companion, Kotetsu, was among the least professional shinobi he had the displeasure to work with. Always flirting or fooling around, it was hardly a surprise that he always seemed to be in a spot of trouble. Meanwhile, because Izumo was such a good friend, he was always trying to get him out of trouble, and somehow always managed to get roped into his friend's punishment instead. Which got him to think, why on earth was he still friends with Kotetsu? Still, he guessed he couldn't complain too much. Guard duty was infinitely less dangerous than anything else the Chunin were regularly asked to do. And they sometimes got to witness some truly interesting moments. Like the arrival of the Uzumaki, a few months ago. Or the daimyo's delegation's arrival for the opening of the Chunin exams, a few hours ago. Or what appeared to be a small army marching their way, murder in their eyes. Wait. Izumo's brain reset itself, and was instantly alert. Eyeing a rock on the ground, he used his foot to kick it to Kotetsu, who quickly snapped out of his boredom-induced stupor. Though he seemed of a mind to complain, he quickly sobered up once he caught sight of the rather intimidating group advancing upon the gates. What had them most worried, however, was the telltale glint of headbands. Shinobi. They couldn't be contestants, however, as the candidates had all arrived several days ago. According to the exam rules, they weren't expecting anyone else. Izumo turned to one of the other guards and pointed at him. Inform the Hokage's office that a large group of potential attackers is incoming, he ordered. The shinobi nodded and promptly disappeared from view. Izumo turned back to the advancing group and soon began to realize that he wasn't dealing with one group of shinobi, but rather four. Iwa. Kiri. Kyumo. Suna. Suddenly, Izumo felt way outside his pay grade. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how one viewed things, it seemed the incoming shinobi were rather distracted, glaring at each other, rather than at him, Kotetsu, and Konoha in general. The sheer tension in the air was enough to make Izumo wish he was better armed than with a simple stick which only really worked against civilians and no one else. Within moments, the mass of angry shinobi were upon them, and Izumo had to summon every ounce of his pride as a Konoha ni not to balk at all the killing intent being thrown around. Halt! He said as firmly as he could, which he hoped was enough to get them to knock it off. He was desperately withholding a shiver, especially as he saw that in the midst of all the shinobi were four palanquins. The types Kages used for official missions. Please identify yourselves and the purpose of your visit. From the mass of angry shinobi, all of whom turned to glare at him and his fellow Konohanin who had come down from the wall to back him up, came forward four individuals. The one from Kiri wore an eye patch and had silver hair. The one from Suna was an older man with the traditional Suna headdress and cloak. The one from Kyumo was a blond man who had a disdainful smile plastered on his face that made Izumo want to punch him on principle. And the one from Iwa was a young woman with a confident strut in her gait and a self-assured demeanor. AO of Kiri. Joseki of Suna, C of Kumo, Kuratsuchi of Iwa. Izumo had a bad feeling about this. Announcing the arrival of the Kazumizutsuki Reikage, they all proclaimed as loudly and concurrently as they could. As if they were all competing with each other to get the first word in. When they obviously failed, they all turned to glare at each other, as did the entourages. Stop butting in, they all managed to shout at each other in perfect harmony. Izumo and his fellow Konohanin sweat dropped at the scene, and he was about to intervene when he felt his lungs almost freeze from the sudden, overpowering pressure that engulfed the area. Only years of life as a shinobi allowed Izumo and his fellow guards to remain standing, while the delegation seemed just as strained. Enough. The powerful, booming voice came from the palanquins, and within moments, the curtains of the one marked with the Kumo symbol parted, revealing a giant of a man of dark complexion stepping out. Proud features were highlighted by a well-groomed mustache and goatee and slicked-back silver hair. His every muscle seemed to be bulging, the way a construction worker's usually did after years of heavy lifting. A golden boar's head worked as the clasp of an equally golden belt, and large golden bracelets peeking out from under his haori. Izumo didn't need an introduction. The bingo book was sufficient to know who he was dealing with. The Reikage. See, he yelled. Blondie cringed, and Izumo felt a sliver of vindictive glee. He hated pretty boys like him, they had all the luck. You are a shinobi of Kumo. Act like it. TSK. Looks like Akuen wants to go straight to business. One by done, the curtains of the remaining 3 palanquins opened up, and out stepped the most remarkable assortment of persons Izumo had seen. From Iwa came a short, stocky, balding man with an impressive nose. From Suna walked out a man in traditional Suna attire, down to the face veil. Then, from Kiri came an elegant, voluptuous woman with auburn hair and a flirty smirk that might have made Izumo uncomfortable, if not for the highly volatile and deadly situation he found himself in. The Reikage blew air out of his nose. Humph, he grunted. If you 3 knew how to keep your men in line, this wouldn't happen. That's rich, the Tsuchikage said. Coming from the man with the least self-control in the world. A's glare could have melted diamonds. You want to test my self-control, Anoki? The Mizukage sniffed disdainfully. Boys, and there he goes. The Kazakage's hat tipped sideways. Such useless talk will only decrease your value, Mizukage-san. Oh my gods, I'm about to bear witness to the start of the 4th Shinobi World War, was all that Izumo was thinking as the killing intent spiked in the group of the most powerful shinobi on the planet. Each Kage looked about ready to kill each other, and their delegations were seemingly ready to mix it up at a moment's notice. Only Konoha and its shinobi stood in the way of complete chaos. Would they be up to the task? Hell the fuck no. Izumo was about ready to bolt back into the village with the guards and order a lockdown while the Kage foursome of doom duked it out outside the hopefully resistant village walls. Fortunately, he was spared from the indignity of having to run for his life like a scared child by the sudden explosion between him and the Kages. Cries of alarm rose out, and Izumo was sure his time was done, when he got a good look at the impact site, and was rewarded with the view of someone's broad, red haori-covered back, a long mane of white hair and a gigantic scroll. I see everyone's as excitable as ever. It took him a few seconds, but Izumo recognized the man, arguably one of the most famous shinobi ever produced by Konoha. Jiraiya. The Toad Sage grinned as he straightened up, and Izumo could see even the Kages were suddenly more wary of the intruder than of each other. Now, why don't we all play nice and talk this over, yeah? The legendary shinobi suggested, jerking his thumb over his shoulder in the general direction of the Hokage Tower. I'm sure you all and the old man have loads to discuss. The Kages glared at Jiraiya, then each other, before they all nodded, one by one. The Reikage's muscles flexed. Fine, he acceded grudgingly. We'll settle the score some other time, Anoki. Anoki smirked. Any time, Akuen. I suppose it's rather unladylike to keep one's host waiting, the Mizukage agreed. Time is money, and one must not waste value, the Kazekage simply said. With that said, the Reikage scrunched his brow, turned to the delegations, and bellowed out, Kimonin. Move out. Similar orders were given by the other Kages, albeit more subtly, and Jiraiya nodded at Izumo before turning to lead the delegations into Konoha, having just averted the outbreak of a major war on its doorstep. Only once they were gone did Izumo, Kotetsu, and the rest of the Konoha guards practically collapse in relief. Who the hell said guard duty was boring? TSK, it seems the plan failed, Shuko-sama. Shuko pouted as she watched the 4 shinobi delegations make their way towards the Hokage Tower. Still glaring at each other, but at peace for now. Shuko shrugged. It was worth it to see those idiots almost have a go at it, she said as her group kept watch from atop a building. Their numbers were suddenly increased when shinobi of Kumo, Kiri, Iwa, and Suna appeared. There was a moment of silence before Shuko smiled. Welcome back, Karen, June, Mickey, Ei. You did good work, she praised. All 4 Uzumaki clansmen knelt before her and bowed their heads, taking off their forged headbands. We were unsuccessful, Shuko-sama, Mickey protested. It was a long shot anyway, Shuko said dismissively. They may just look like dum-dums, but they ain't Kages for nothing. Fireworks shot out into the darkening sky then, exploding high overhead in a myriad of colored lights. All of her entourage followed her gaze upwards, and Shuko smiled. The Chunin exams had officially started. Besides, the fun's only just begun. The next day today was not just another day for Konoha. Though the sky remained blue, the birds kept chirping, and people went about their business as usual. There was something in the air that made everyone realize that today was unlike any other day in the year. The Chunin exams were finally upon them. And Naruto was freaking the fuck out. Now, normally, Naruto wasn't one to lie down when something went wrong or someone got up in his face. If life threw him lemons, he took those lemons and beat life to death with them. Then, he would pour the juice into life's wounds, just to remind life that he wasn't someone to boss around. So it was that morning, he had woken up refreshed, energized, and decidedly looking forward to the exams, now that his chakra restraining seal was about to expire. Without it, he would finally be able to reveal the true depths of his skill, thoroughly shocking Konoha and Elder Shuko, who were likely expecting him to be the greatest failure in recent memory. So, almost skipping, he had left the compound amidst the encouraging cheers of his family, feeling almost like a rock star. His confidence was at an all-time high, and he had no doubts that, between him, Shikamaru, and Sakura, they would kick ass and take names. So happy was he that he waved and greeted everyone on his path, regardless of whether or not they were glaring at him or even insulted him in return. Hell, he even stopped at one point to help out a little girl whose balloon had floated away just out of reach. She even thanked him by shaking his hand excitedly and wishing him luck. It was all he could do to keep a straight face as he arrived at the testing center, where he was supposed to meet his far more reluctant teammates. How surprised they would be when he told them the truth, and then shared with them the moment his seal disappeared, thereby unleashing the true might of Uzumaki Naruto upon the world. Except it wasn't disappearing. Just before Naruto had decided to tell his teammates the truth, he'd decided to check the seal, just to time things right. If he'd calculated correctly, there were about 5 minutes left on the seal, but he'd wanted to make sure. If he was right, the seal's remaining line should be almost completely faded. It was pitch black. Pitch black. That meant he didn't have 5 minutes left on his seal. He had 1 day left. Which was impossible, of course. He'd been keeping a steady eye on his seal ever since it was placed on him, and he'd seen the last line start to dissolve all of last night, and again this morning. Keisuke and Hayako had personally inspected it. Kimiko had seen it. Hell, he had checked it not 20 minutes ago, and why was it pitch black? Oi, Naruto. Naruto froze, mid-panic attack. Shikamaru. Sakura. Right. Chunin exam. Right. Keep it together. This was nothing. One more day. He could handle that. As long as nothing involving chakra was involved, he was sure he could pass without a problem. Maybe. There you are. Sakura said exasperatedly as she and Shikamaru approached him. So, are you ready? She asked doubtfully. I heard the first part's a test. Well, shit. It's probably nothing that straightforward, Shikamaru pointed out, unknowingly providing his blonde teammate much relief. Encyclopedic knowledge isn't exactly a critical skill for Chunin. Sakura shrugged. Just saying what I heard, she said, before cocking an eyebrow at Naruto. What's with you? You're not half as hyperactive as you usually are. Indeed. Instead of being the loud-mouthed punk he'd pretended to be these past few weeks, Naruto was instead looking more like a cornered rat sweating bullets, looking everywhere, twitching honestly. If his friends hadn't known better, they would have thought he was an addict undergoing withdrawal. Naruto laughed nervously, scratching his nape with a ferocity usually reserved for dogs and cats feeling really itchy. What? Me? No. That's crazy, he rambled. I'm not worried at all. Crazy. Hey, how about we go inside? Don't want to miss out on that awesome test. With that said, Naruto turned on his heel and almost robotically marched into the testing center, giving the fakest laugh ever, leaving behind two bewildered teammates. Okay, I know I don't give the baka much credit to begin with, Sakura spoke up. But that wasn't normal, right? Shikamaru's eyes narrowed at Naruto's retreating back. No, that was most certainly not normal, and given his previous doubts about his teammate's sudden skill drop, served to vindicate, at the very least, the possibility that he'd been correct. If so, then something had clearly gone wrong. Or Naruto had finally wised up, and was only now realizing how screwed he was, after having slacked off for weeks. It was sort of depressing how either possibility was just as likely to be true. Was it really necessary to tamper with his seal, Shuko-sama? Shuko grinned as she swung her legs off the bench opposite the testing center, balloon in hand. It's just a bit of harmless fun, she said dismissively. Those old farts thought they could pull one on me, so I just paid back the favor. Wisely, no one in her hidden entourage pointed out that she was just as old as the aforementioned clan elders. Or that she had been conned into this. As immature as Shuko acted at times, her wrath was significantly less innocent. Shuko giggled as she watched the boy, Naruto, freaking out by himself. She had honestly not planned to come face to face with the boy who'd basically caused this whole series of events just yet. She'd hoped to face him later, in her older persona. A meeting wherein she would intimidate the crap out of him with her abilities, and show him how unprepared he was. But life was all about coincidences. She'd run into him while going around town having fun. It had been a while, after all, since she and the rest of her clansmen had been in such a large population center as Konoha. Her cell tended to specialize in espionage missions and tactical advice, but as a rule avoided large cities for fear of running into someone who could ID them. This would be the first time in decades or in their lives, for the younger generations, that any of them set foot in a major shinobi village. Why not enjoy themselves, then? So, Shuko had given them the day off, while she herself went about posing as just another kid visiting the village. Her hair was dyed, of course, and she had no Uzumaki crests anywhere on her clothing, so no one really looked at her twice as she enjoyed the sights. She had just acquired a balloon when a stiff breeze had all but ripped it out of her childlike grip, and was just about to give it up as a bad job when a blonde blur had appeared and grabbed the string just before it flew away. That had been Uzumaki Naruto. It didn't take long for her to recognize him, less than a second, in fact thanks to the detailed profile her shinobi had drafted. She recognized his facial markings at once, as well as the blonde hair, blue eyes, and mischievous look in his eyes. It almost hurt her to have to mess with this boy. Almost. Besides, if his profile was right, he'd appreciate the joke. So she played the part of the thankful little girl, calling him Nii-chan and everything, and shook his hand to bump up his confidence. Only, while she had done so, she had felt the presence of the chakra restraining seal on the boy's wrist, and immediately understood Keisuke and Hayako's plan. Not one to take such a bold move lying down, she discreetly tampered with the seal to extend its life by 1 day. There. Now Naruto would have to prove his mental acuity, without just relying on brute force. That had always been the biggest sticking point between her and the other elders. Keisuke, Hayako hell, even that old fart Akio. They all thought brute strength and her courage were what was important in battle, while she was the lone voice of strategy. Well, she had proven them wrong. Unlike every other cell, hers was the only one who hadn't been forced to move around after the split. Her strategies had kept her clansmen safe, which also meant hers was numerically the largest of them all. It was little wonder Keisuke and Hayako wanted her cell back with her clansmen at their disposal. The Konoha Uzumaki would see their numbers double. And the boy who was supposed to be the means of achieving that goal was now stuck in her trap. She almost felt like laughing evilly. But then that would attract unwanted attention. So, instead, she settled for grinning and people watching while she waited for the first exam's results. Without chakra, how would her clansman perform? Would he sink or swim? He was so screwed. Naruto was sweating profusely in his seat, staring blankly at the sheet of super complicated problems in front of him, wondering what on earth he'd done to piss off the powers that be. Not one of these problems were remotely within his limited grasp of theoretical shinobi knowledge. Sure, he wasn't as completely stupid as he'd been before he'd gotten access to a decent education, but even given that consideration, this was way beyond him. So why were Sakura and Shikamaru seemingly breezing right through? It also didn't help that the exam proctors looked super tense, emitting what he recognized as killing intent pretty steadily. Something which, he realized, most of the foreign candidates were doing as well. It was as though the entire room was a cough away from becoming a war zone. And what was up with those weird freaking rules? 2 points for every time caught cheating. The whole team failed if one person failed. Were they trying to tailor this exam to screw him over? What he wouldn't give to be invisible right now. Maybe then he had a chance in hell to cheat off of Sumio. A light bulb went off in his head. Cheat. That's right. He could cheat. He had 10 points to burn trying to cheat, and as long as he didn't zero out, his team wouldn't fail. This exam was made for cheating. Which did absolutely nothing to fix his situation, because he just so happened to be one of the least subtle people in Konoha when it came to cheating. He was an open book whenever he wasn't trying to push down his loneliness, so whenever he tried to cheat at the academy, he would inevitably end up giving himself away by his own expression of cunning delight, as Irika once called it. Which meant he was still screwed unless he managed to think up of a way to cheat without being caught. Delving into his usual bag of tricks wouldn't cut it. All he really knew how to do was Kawarimi, Kage Bunshin, Henge, and whatever taijutsu Takeshi had beat into his head. Nor did his limited knowledge of seals help any either. All Keisuke, Hayako, and Maki had taught him were the basics. He reminded himself he still hadn't pranked Kimiko for forcing him and his friends to go through what was apparently useless meditative practice in Wave. None of which was useful in trying to cheat. He idly wondered if he could get away with setting the room on fire. No. He shook his head violently, unaware of the amused gazes he was attracting from the exam proctors. He had to deal with this right. He'd been warned by Kimiko that Shuko would be paying careful attention to his actions at every stage of the Chunin exams, so he could ill afford to make a fool of himself here. Think. Excuse me, may I go to the bathroom? Naruto's head shot up, seeing one of the Suna candidates, the weird, makeup-wearing dude from the other day who'd picked on the Hokage's grandson standing at his seat. Naruto felt like punching him. Of course they weren't going to let him do that. They were in a test. A super awesome fate-deciding test of destiny, where the Chunin were separated from the... Alright. but make it snappy. Naruto's jaw dropped. He watched as the Suna candidate was shown out by a proctor, feeling too stunned to properly react. However, just as the proctor closed the door behind him, Naruto had a great idea. Well, 12% of an idea. Maybe 10. Either way, it was more than he had 20 minutes ago. He waited a bit, 5 minutes in total, before he discreetly put his hand over his stomach, charged it full of chakra, and tapped it with a Hakusho strike. Naturally, it felt like someone had rammed a tree into his stomach, and it really was all he could do not to hurl right there. Shakily, he really was in a lot of pain. He raised his hand. "Sorry, but I think I need to go hurl," he said with a weak smile. By the looks of disgust from the head proctor, Naruto knew he'd sold the man. He noticed that the two shinobi next to him had also bought his act, and were edging away from him. Good, it would help sell his story all the better. "Ugh, just go," said the head proctor. "Ibiki something or another." The man pointed at one of his assistants, the one Naruto vaguely recognized as Kotetsu, from the village gates. "You. Take this weakling to the bathroom." Naruto almost rolled his eyes and his cover but managed to restrain himself as he had the handcuffs put on him. They were flimsy things, thin metal cuffs attached to each other by thin metallic links which he had little doubt he could easily break out of. Fortunately, he didn't need to. In hindsight, he was insanely lucky that they had chosen to use the Ninja Academy as the testing center for the first part of the Chunin exams. He knew this place like the back of his hand, and he knew that between here and the bathroom was a hallway with a window looking out into the yard. He waited until he and his escort reached said window, at which point he faked a stumble. Fortunately, the proctor's leash kept him standing, but the momentary vision block allowed Naruto to quietly summon a Kage Bunshin just outside the window, out of the proctor's immediate field of vision. He winced as the chakra restraining seal made the act rather painful, having forced him to squeeze out as much as he could. It was a miracle it had worked at all. "Hey! Get a hold of yourself," the man chided him as he pulled Naruto back onto his feet. Naruto, still feeling the effects of that Hakusho blow to his stomach, did an excellent impression of suffering from an ill stomach, mostly because he really was. "Sorry. Guess I shouldn't have drank that milk this morning," he apologized before resuming their trek to the bathroom. The plan was in motion, and now all he had to do was hope that the clone didn't blow it. Clone Naruto knew exactly what to do. The problem, however, was that he had no idea how to do it. Quickly making his way back down to the ground floor while avoiding all the windows, Clone Naruto began to wonder just how exactly he was supposed to pull off the original's arguably good plan. The idea was to take advantage of the fact that he could pass on memories back to the original, but before he could do that, he needed to get to the answers. And how was he supposed to do that, when all of the answers were in the testing room? He paused. They were, right? Clone Naruto realized that they really had no idea. Still, he had to focus on what he knew. The test answers were in that testing room, and the only ones who likely had access to those answers were the proctors. Like the one that was escorting original Naruto. An evil grin formed on his face. Naruto made good on his excuse of needing to throw up. Pushing in 2 fingers to the back of his throat, he retched quite loudly for his escort's benefit, hoping meanwhile that his clone had found a way to get to the test answers. By the time he had worn out his excuse, however, he found himself feeling increasing amounts of panic as he realized the clone had yet to dispel, meaning he hadn't managed to complete his mission yet. "Geez, there's one puker every year," moaned his escort as they walked back to the testing room. On the way there, however, Naruto saw another Chunin proctor approach, and Naruto felt a stab of panic as he wondered if his clone had been caught. "Kotetsu," the man addressed his escort, extending a hand. "Something's come up." Naruto glanced up at his escort nervously, wondering if this was the end of the line for him, Sakura, and Shikamaru. If so, he had no doubts both would make their displeasure with him abundantly clear in the most violent ways imaginable. "What's up, Koga?" his escort asked. "Hokage says something's up at the east gate. The guards there are having trouble with procedure. and since you're there all the time, Naruto watched his proctor escort twitch a bit at the mention of the gates. Obviously, he wasn't very happy with his usual duties. What procedure? He asked tightly. There was a pause before the other proctor shrugged. How the hell should I know? I'm just the messenger. Hokage says he wants you there, and that's all I really care to know. There was another pause before Kotetsu slowly handed over Naruto's leash. Alright. Just checking. Get him back before Ibiki blows a gasket, yeah? The other proctor nodded and then pulled at Naruto, bringing him in closer. You got it, he told Kotetsu, who gave him a long stare before shrugging and disappearing via Shunshin. Dumbass. Naruto's eyes widened as he connected the dots, grinning up at the proctor, who grinned right back in a very familiar fashion. Raising fists, they bumped their knuckles together in celebration at a plan well executed. Nicely done, he praised. Honestly, it was. With the chakra seal still in play, he'd feared the clone would dispel upon trying any jutsu, yet it had managed to pull off a convincing henge. The henged clone gave him a thumbs up. But you need to henge back into Kotetsu or else we're blown. With a nod, the clone followed his instructions, and he was soon back in the hands of Kotetsu. Without delaying any further, time was running out. After all, they both made their way back to the testing room, where Ibiki raised an eyebrow at the duo, but said nothing more. Once back in his seat, Naruto watched as Kotetsu retook his place among the other proctors and began observing the other candidates. He made a great show of silently watching them for any slip-ups, to the point where Naruto felt like throwing him a paper ball to remind him they were on a tight schedule. Then, just as his patience was wearing thin, Kotetsu got up, deliberately walked over to one of the candidates up front, and grabbed the young man's hand. Number 78. You're out, he said icily. 76, 77. You too. Naruto watched the three genin all from Kiri, interestingly enough, slump their shoulders as they were finally caught out. Kotetsu grabbed their papers and walked them out, closing the door behind him. Honestly, picking people to flunk wouldn't have been that hard. There were maybe 1 out of every 20 people in the room who probably knew how to answer the questions without help. That meant that his clone could pick any of the remaining 19 and accuse them of cheating, and he would be right. Moments later, Naruto felt a deluge of information flood his brain as his clone dispelled, and grinned, pencil at the ready. Whoever had messed with his seal was going to see that Uzumaki Naruto was not going to take things lying down. After the test, Shuko's eyebrows were twitching, torn between amusement and disdain. Before the tests had begun, Shuko had made her shinobi go around the village planting monitoring seals in strategic locations. As Shuko knew that the Chunin exams typically had theoretical, practical, and combat components, she had deduced that they would likely need a testing center, which the Shinobi Academy provided perfectly. Naturally, then, it was full of her monitoring seals, and watching the feed now, she was torn between hurting Naruto and laughing incredulously. She had to give the boy credit, his plan had taken guts. If the clone had been pushed for more detailed confirmation by the exam proctor, she had little doubt the blonde's plan would have fallen apart immediately. Still, with most of his chakra sealed away, the boy's plan hadn't been a bad oneif, perhaps somewhat sloppy. She had seen enough for the first component, however. With what she'd seen, she could calculate a 98% chance that Naruto and his team would manage to reach the second test. With that in mind, she decided to leave her monitoring aside for now, and move on to the other purpose of her trip here, a visit to the Konoha Uzumaki compound. She opened her eyes, severing her mental link to the monitoring seals, and spoke aloud to her hiding clansmen. Have Karen-chan maintain her cover and continue her monitoring, while avoiding as much contact as possible with the boy and his teammates. She hopped off the bench, balloon in hand, and walked away from the academy. It spoke to her shinobi's reliability that she didn't wait around for an acknowledgement. They would simply get the job done. As she made her way towards the compound, however, she bumped into a group that caught her attention. The group of foreigners were arguing quite loudly in the middle of the street, and from their headbands, she could tell these were members of the visiting Kage's escorts. Yet, standing off from them was another shinobi, who seemed content in watching the argument unfold. Despite wearing an IWA headband, there was something about him that rubbed her the wrong way. Call it a lifetime's worth of experience, but Shuko doubted that man came from IWA. She thought back to the moment when the Kages had arrived. Her shinobi had attempted to infiltrate their ranks in order to plant tracker seals on the visiting Kages themselves. It always paid off to know where the most powerful pieces on the board were, but had been unsuccessful due to the heavy security protocols in place. Yet, all of her clansmen had told her the same thing: the groups were acting much more hostile towards each other than they should have been. It was as though someone was purposefully inciting conflict. Now, truthfully, Shuko would have loved to see the shinobi of Kumo, IWA, Kiri, and Suna kill each other. In fact, were it not for the fact that she had clansmen here, she would have deliberately tried to incite such a war, given the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Her hatred of the shinobi villages ran deep, but her commitment to family ran deeper. So she restrained herself, mentally reassuring herself that there would be other occasions. Yet it seemed that someone was actively attempting to do that very thing she'd fantasized of doing. If so, this was an unfortunate variable that had to be taken into account for her plans regarding Naruto. She could ill afford someone else barging in on her turf, after all. She waited until she had cleared the scene of the increasingly hostile argument before addressing her unseen escort. "Takeru, Yukimaru," she called softly. "Follow that IWA nin and report back," she ordered, never actually pointing at the target, lest it give her away. "Make sure you don't get made." Once again, she received no answer, but needed none. A smile crept onto her face. It seemed the Chunin exams were going to be much more interesting than she'd initially thought. "Back in the testing center, I told you before," Naruto exclaimed, standing at his seat, holding out a defiant fist towards Ibiki. "I don't run. I don't quit. I'll follow my unwavering path to the bitter end. That's my ninja way." Shikamaru was torn between clapping or punching Naruto for the briefest moment of panic he'd felt when he saw the blonde boy raise his hand after Ibiki had asked who else wanted to quit before the 10th question. To be honest, he'd been amazed that Naruto had held it together as well as he had during the test, except for that minor vomiting episode, which he was almost 100% sure was made up. Still, it had been nerve-wracking for the first few minutes, when he'd realized that the questions on the test were far beyond Naruto's abilities. Or hell, his abilities, too. That was why, instead of even trying to answer all of them, Shikamaru had opted to focus on the couple he was able to understand, particularly the cryptography part. He was good at puzzles like that. Even if he didn't get the full 10 points, as long as he managed to get even just one, his team would pass. Slacking at its finest. The problem lay with Naruto. He'd thought the boy would give up upon seeing the difficulty of the test, but if his observations were correct, Naruto had managed to deduce a way to cheat without being caught. Or, at least, caught 5 times. If so, then his prior observations regarding the boy's true skills were right on the money. He knew that his fellow genin were still finding it hard to believe that Naruto would have any skills to hide, but Shikamaru, along with Hinata and Kiba, was dead certain there was more to the boy than met the eye. And now he had proof. A failure would never have stood up to Marino Ibiki, of all people, the way Naruto had. They wouldn't have had the confidence to speak the way he did. Even if Naruto was being an optimistic fool, thinking he could even win the whole Chunin exams, there was no denying the rough honor and courage that beat in the blonde's chest. And there was no convincing him otherwise. Then, Ibiki spoke up, giving off a rather evil smirk as Naruto stood there still, fist still outstretched. "To all the remaining teams, congratulations on passing." Shikamaru sighed, having predicted this might be the logical outcome of the 10th question's impossible scenario. There was no way Ibiki, a mere jounin from Konoha, had any right to ban applicants from testing again anywhere else in the continent. That meant it was a trick question, and while Shikamaru would have loved it if Naruto had let other, weaker teams drop out, he wasn't going to complain now that he had proof that Naruto wasn't the deadbeat loser he'd appeared to be these past few weeks. Shikamaru zoned out while Ibiki went on to talk about the importance of duty and how one had to be able to take difficult decisions. It was all stuff he'd heard from his father before a million times, though he supposed it was also something of a wake-up call for his teammates. Instead, Shikamaru fell back on fifth favorite, or least troublesome, activity: deciphering Naruto. There was no question that the boy had faked his idiocy these past few weeks, but that now begged the question: why? Who had Naruto been trying to fake out? His skills had been well established among the genin before the mission to Nami, and Hinata and Kiba had both asserted that he'd improved tons during the mission, so Shikamaru doubted this was for Konoha's benefit. Especially since the two people who ought to know the truth, Kakashi and the Hokage, both seemed to be on it, given their utter lack of disciplinary measures against Naruto. Nor did he believe Naruto to be targeting his own clan. In fact, he rather suspected the Uzumaki to be responsible for this plan. That meant there was another party he was unaware of that Naruto and his family, plus Kakashi and the Hokage, were trying to swindle in some way. Not only that, it was apparently significant that Naruto completely sold the lie by even lying to his friends. Then there was Naruto's reaction at the beginning of the test. Rather than act like the dumbass he'd been pretending to be these past few weeks, Naruto had seemed on the verge of a panic attack. Not so much because of the test, but because of something else. Perhaps something had gone wrong in his ruse? It seemed the most logical possibility, if he discarded the idea that Naruto was simply panicking because he really was a dumbass and was only now realizing how utterly fucked he was. He resolved to find out, just as soon as Ibiki was finished with his crash. Shikamaru's sweat dropped as quite possibly the least decent shinobi in Konoha made a way over the top entrance, crashing through the window and unfurling a ridiculously large banner. He'd heard of her, of course, Mitarashi Enko. His father had mentioned her on occasion, usually in relation to her work as part of Ibiki's infamous torture and interrogation division. Oddly enough, she reminded him of Naruto, especially when she realized how unnecessarily loud she was and how much her sense of timing sucked. Fortunately, she rallied fast enough to make a snarky comment about how Ibiki was getting soft if this test was soft. Shikamaru didn't want to know what hard was and how she would cut them down by half a clue. And was just about done telling them where to go for the second test, before promptly jumping out the window. Training Ground 44. Unsurprising, given what he knew about Enko. Troublesome as hell, sure, but unsurprising. The so-called Forest of Death sounded exactly up her alley. He met up with Sakura before he found Naruto, and found his pink-haired teammate to be in a pensive mood. "Let me guess," he said as he approached her. "Naruto." Sakura eyed her teammate. Once upon a time, she might have dismissed him as some lazy layabout, but having trained next to him and seen him pull out all stops, she knew him to be among the most brilliant people she knew. "Yeah," she confirmed reluctantly. "I'm guessing this is where you tell me, 'I told you so'?" she asked ruefully. Shikamaru shrugged. "I ain't that petty," he said, leaning against a wall as they waited for Naruto to show up. "But I did tell you so," he then added with a sly smirk. Sakura punched him lightly in the arm. "Jerk," she mumbled, clearly feeling conflicted after having witnessed Naruto's sudden change of heart. Part of her still obviously felt the boy was beneath her notice, but another, growing part of her had begun to see what Hinata, Kiba, and Shikamaru saw in him. When he'd spoken up against Ibiki, Sakura had been on the verge of a panic attack, and Naruto inept, deadbeat, loser Naruto single-handedly blew away every one of her concerns. In that one brief moment, she had looked at Naruto and not seen some misfit who would drag her down, but someone she would follow into battle without a second thought. Shikamaru let his pink-haired teammate sort out her feelings as he leaned against the wall next to her, waiting until Naruto finally detached himself from the mass of students filing out, waving at his team excitedly. "There you are," Shikamaru greeted him loudly, snapping Sakura out of her thoughts. He pushed himself off the wall and smirked. "That was a hell of a scare you gave us, dumbass." Naruto grinned. Acerried about that, he apologized half-heartedly, scratching the back of his neck. That bastard ticked me off, you know. Shikamaru shook his head in mock exasperation. One of these days, Naruto, you're going to have to stop being so damn troublesome, he said as he waved at his team to follow him. They were practically the last ones in leaving. Come on. Let's see what that crazy chick has in store for us. Sakura and Naruto both nodded, the former seemingly having regained a bit of her confidence as she clenched her fists, emulating Naruto's confident smile. Yeah. Hinata and Kiba felt conflicted. Both genin had gone into the exam with one real objective in mind: Naruto. The former desperately wanted to find evidence that the boy she deeply admired in Nami was not an illusion, while the latter intended to vindicate his belief that he needed to punch Naruto back onto the right path. Results were mixed. Hinata had easily breezed through the test, having realized the whole point of it and used her Byakugan to gather the necessary information. Kiba, for his part, had depended on Akamaru perched on his head to relay what information he could see. Both had managed to complete the test in half the time provided. So the other half they just observed Naruto. Neither sat close by, but both had good vantage points to see his back. Hinata fretted as she watched Naruto go through the obvious physical signs of panic, while Kiba tightened his fist around his pencil with increasing anger, until finally it snapped in half in his hand. Then Naruto asked to go to the bathroom because he needed to puke, and Kiba was just about ready to charge the blonde and beat him senseless on the spot. Hinata, however, was far less hot-headed, and noticed, thanks to her handy-dandy Byakugan, that Naruto had purposefully injured himself. Stunned by the sudden turn of events, she followed his progress out of the room and saw the moment he had created his iconic Kage Bunshin. Relief flooded her system as she watched the whole series of events unfold. There he was. There was her Naruto. The cunning prankster and clever shinobi. He had figured out a way out of this test, just like he would have done in Nami. But at the same time, Hinata saw that the one clone had cost Naruto a lot. His entire chakra system was straining to produce it, and she felt wonder at the fact that he hadn't collapsed. How was that possible? She'd seen his chakra system before. His reserves were, well, vast, didn't really cover it. She'd seen him produce dozens, hundreds of clones before, so why was he straining just to create the one? She thought back to the past few weeks, when he'd managed to unknowingly break her heart every day as he acted the fool. In retrospect, she had rarely, if ever, seen him use a technique during those days. Nor had she really paid his chakra system any attention, given that she'd already seen it in Nami. But now that she did pay attention, he was clearly struggling to mold his chakra, which just wasn't possible. One didn't develop such a condition overnight, especially when one had a fully functional system all their lives. So while she was relieved that the boy she deeply admired was not the idiot everyone thought he was, she was now also racked with worry, as she realized that he was not in any condition to be in these exams. Kiba, for his part, was much more straightforward. Naruto was still acting like a pathetic weakling, when he knew he wasn't. That either meant Naruto had always been a weakling and dumb luck had saved his hide, or Naruto was lying to him, and so needed to be taught a lesson in deceiving his friends. Both scenarios ended with the same result: Kiba punching Naruto repeatedly until the blonde apologized and made amends. Both of Naruto's former teammates eyed the looming forest of death. One with apprehension, another with conviction. Whatever their feelings were about the blonde, this place would be the stage on which they would get their answers. Uzumaki compound, you did what? Kimiko was on her feet, panicked expression marring her beautiful features, as she stared at the back of the red-headed child sitting quite relaxedly before the elders. Uzumaki Shuko. However, Kimiko wasn't the only one to have reacted poorly to the news. Hikari, sitting beside her for the first time in years, had her hands covering her mouth in horror at what Shuko had announced, while the others of their generation, Raiden and his group excluded, all emulated their expressions to one degree or another. Naruto-sama. Hikari breathed, her voice muffled by her hands. Keisuke, for his part, looked pissed. Tampering with a seal is a dangerous and foolish game, Shuko, he rumbled as he stood up. Despite his diminutive height, Uzumaki Keisuke was still capable of emitting powerful killing intent, which was now all directed at the bored-looking Shuko. Her accompanying clansmen, sitting on the right side of the meeting hall, tensed at the act, their unreadable stares aimed at the Konoha Uzumaki across the small pathway left open for Shuko. Especially given the circumstances. Shuko pouted, idly playing with her hair. Moyogai started it, she pointed out childishly, yet also reminding Keisuke that this was a battle of his making. Tricking me with that bet and it's not nice to trick children. Veins bulged on Keisuke's bald head as he listened to Shuko exculpate herself of all guilt in this worst-case scenario. Shuko, he yelled, his chakra flaring. Next to him, Hayako's own glare at her childlike colleague increased, her own chakra building up. Do you mean to kill the clan head? Neither elder's actions had any impact on Shuko's mood, as she simply smiled slyly and unleashed her own chakra reserves. It was a sobering reminder that all three of them stood on equal grounds. If any of them really decided to go all out, there would be nothing left of the compound but a steaming crater. Now, she chided in a sing-song voice. If you didn't want me to fool around with his seal like that, then maybe you shouldn't have put it on him in the first place, she reminded them. You both knew what I'm like, and you know I don't like being tricked. Naruto-sama will just have to make do without his chakra for a little while longer. If he's as good as you think he is, I'm sure he'll survive. The way Shuko had mockingly stated Naruto's name made Kimiko's chakra flare, responded in kind by one of Shuko's clansmen, whom Kimiko was shocked to recognize. You, she gasped, staring at the other side of the hall. Shuko smiled back at her. Kimiko-chan, she acknowledged the Uzumaki enforcer at last. I figured you, of all people, would be thrilled at my little prank, she said, giggling, before turning back to the elders. But if not, then maybe Isamu-chan can play with you, if you want someone to help you vent. Kimiko grit her teeth, forcing herself to back down. Uzumaki Isamu was the one person in Shuko's cell she had never managed to beat, yet had never beaten her either. In every occasion that she'd attempted to force Shuko to reunite with the other cells, she had forced Kimiko to fight a series of champions until she reached Isamu, at which point she would inevitably fight to a draw. That's what I thought, Shuko sang, before getting to her feet. Shuko. Keisuke raised his voice again. We're not done here. Shuko gave him a bored look. Yes, Keisuke, we are, she said flatly. Until your golden child is back, one way or another, we're done here. Either he succeeds, in which case you've won the bet, or he fails, in which case I win the bet, and you leave us alone for good. Shuko paused, cutely pushing up her lower lip in mock thought. But well odds are, I'm going to win now, Soda. With that, she giggled all the way out of the hall, her clansmen diligently, but silently following her lead. Kimiko shot Isamu a glare, who responded with a taunting smile as he followed his clansmen out. We need to postpone the exam. Hikari cried out once Shuko and her clansmen had left. If we tell them Naruto-sama has been unfairly tampered with. Keisuke fell down onto his ass, looking defeated. We can't, he said through gritted teeth. The Hokage made that clear to us. No matter what happened after the first test began, we were not to interfere, he explained. He can't afford us making a scene while the 5 Kage summit is underway. But surely, given the circumstances. Akemi spoke up, looking just as scared as the others. If Naruto died because of his lack of chakra, not only would that be an incalculable tragedy for the clan, it would also annihilate any hopes they had of bringing the family back together. I'm afraid the Hokage's word was final, Akemi-chan, Hayako said firmly. We can do nothing for Naruto-sama. Except pray, and hope he comes out safely, Keisuke added, covering his eyes to hide away his frustrated glare. Damn it, Shuko. Kimiko all but slammed her head against the tatami floor just then, surprising everyone. "Elders," she cried out. This is my fault," she claimed, uncaring that the impact of her headbutt against the floor had actually broken skin and was marring the tatamas with her blood. She ignored the cries of alarm among her clansmen, or even Sora's insistent offer to heal her. "I am the one who thought of tricking Elder Shuko. And because of that, because of my stupidity, I must be punished." Hikari looked down at her sadly, her hand hovering over her bent back, as though unsure whether or not to try and comfort her. Kimiko-chan, Natsu, Yuki, and the rest, all of whom were used to the far less emotional, far more mechanical Kimiko of the past, stared at her disbelievingly. Never in their lives had they imagined they would have ever seen the day where Kimiko would become this bent out of shape over the fate of anyone else. Keisuke sighed. "No one will be getting punished, Kimiko." Hayako nodded, looking at the wounded Uzumaki enforcer with a sad smile. "We couldn't have predicted Shuko would go this far just to win the bet," she added. "You did the best you could, under the circumstances." But she was suddenly cut off when a fist grabbed her by the back of her head and forcefully lifted her up. She squinted in pain as the strong grip pulled at her hair, and through her squint saw Takashi's fierce grin. "Gihi. Don't mock my training, Kimiko," he warned, before letting her go and getting up to his feet. "I ain't trained no weakling." He punched his open palm and gave the elders a twisted grin. "If that bitch thinks any pupil of mine's gonna crash and burn because his chakra's gone, she's got another thing coming to her." "That's right." All eyes turned to see Maki hopping onto her feet, planting both fists onto her hips. "Naruto-sama may be a bit slow, but he's learned enough about sealing to be miles ahead of anyone else in these exams," she said confidently, winking at Hikari and Kimiko. "And if all goes wrong, he's still got that seal to fall back to. You'll see." Maki and Takashi exchanged confident smiles before extending their hands and bumping fists before the rest of their clan. Kimiko, Hikari, and the rest of their clansmen looked up at them with growing hope. Perhaps there was a way, after all. Naruto-sama will win. Naruto gazed upon his wrist, the chakra-restraining seal finally losing some of its opacity. Moments ago, he had come clean to Shikamaru and Sakura about everything. The bet with Shuko, the seal, the charade of the past few weeks, everything. Needless to say, once Sakura had wailed on him enough to vent her frustration at him, she and Shikamaru had come to the conclusion that he'd done what he'd had to do, for the sake of family. Sakura even conceded, somewhat reluctantly, that it made him a bit cooler. Naruto managed to waste that goodwill exactly 2 seconds later, when he asked her on a date. The subsequent punch essentially restored their relations to their usual, friendly, one-sided bickering. Shikamaru, for his part, had just nodded at him in respect once Naruto was done explaining. But now, his team stood before the gates of Training Grounds 44, the Forest of Death. With a heaven scroll in hand, they awaited the starting signal for the second task to begin, and Naruto wasn't so conceited he would deny being a bit nervous. Without his chakra reserves on hand, his skill list was severely diminished. All he really had left in him was perhaps one Kage Bunshin, Taijutsu, and whatever seals he could pull off, although given his rookie training and the lack of chakra he could pour into them, they would be quite weak right now. Unless he used that seal, but Maki-chan had been exceptionally clear that he was to under no circumstance use that seal unless there were no other option. According to what he remembered from her explanation, it was a very powerful seal, designed for situations where the user was forced to go ahead of the team alone, but required skills they did not have. It sounded awesome, and Maki had giggled in a somewhat unstable fashion at the mere thought of it, which was, terrifyingly enough, a good sign among the Uzumaki, but she had also warned that it came at a cost. Whoever used the seal would be so drained by its effects that it would knock them out for at least 24 hours. According to her explanation, there had been cases of Uzumaki clansmen simply ending up comatose after a particularly harrowing use of it. The only reason she had even given him the secrets to the seal was because he was Jinchuriki, so she had theorized that the Kyuubi's power and self-preservation instincts would keep him alive and in one piece. He really wished, at times, that his clansmen wouldn't gamble with his life like that, but just as quickly, he thanked both his master and Maki-chan for having even bothered to train him. If he hadn't learned a thing at their hands, and just relied on the age-old tricks he'd known before his family had come back into his life, he might have felt terrified by what he was about to face. Instead, he felt ready. A little anchored down, but ready. Whatever had happened to the chakra-restraining seal would have to wait. For now, he and his team just needed to survive another 18 hours, and then the seal would wear off, his chakra restored. Shikamaru. Sakura-chan, he addressed his teammates, who nodded behind him, faces set in grim determination. The signal flare went off. Let's go. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share. Want early audio-only versions? Join me on Patreon, link in description. I'm Fox Sage, see you next time.